billionaire, and he convinced Forbes that he was. I don't think he's a billionaire right now. I think Michelle Wolf was absolutely right. You want to get Trump? Point out that he's not a rich guy. I mean, he's so poor he has to rip off contractors. We've had more than one of them on this program talking about how Trump promised to pay them and all this kind of stuff, and then they just, he just ripped him off. He refused to pay. He's been sued a couple thousand times, or he's been involved in several thousand lawsuits. And I would guess, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but I'd guess that a substantial percentage of those have to do with his lying. David Leonhardt points out that this has really helped him out in business. He could make his business look more successful than it was. I mean, basically, the Trump Organization is a small-time company that's heavily leveraged. They're in debt up to their eyeballs. They own some real estate and they market Trump's name. But most of the things that he's involved himself in have been utter failures, from his steaks to his vodka to his airline. And now you've got buildings, tried to take his name off. They successfully did this in Panama. They successfully did it in New York City. So number one, he lied about his wealth and about his businesses, and it helped him be successful business-wise. His lies helped land him a primetime television show. MSN or NBC, played along with the lie that Donald Trump was one of the most successful businessmen in America. He was just the biggest hustler. He's P.T. Barnum for our era. Except that P.T. Barnum actually valued the truth. And, of course, Donald Trump's lies made him president. He lied about his opponents. He lied about what he was going to do. He lied to the American people aggressively. And Leonhardt points out, in addition to lying, Donald Trump has been willing to obstruct justice, trying to end the investigation of Michael Flynn, clearing the room so that he could, basically try to intimidate Comey in private, firing Comey because Comey wouldn't go along with him. I mean, you look at the questions that Mueller has for Trump, which were published, were published in the New York Times yesterday and are now like the top story. And the question that I'm asking out of this, and that, I'd love to hear your take on, is how do you deal with this? How does the media deal with this? I mean, here, the New York Times has this piece called The 459 People, Places, and Things Donald Trump Has Insulted on Twitter, a complete list. Just on Twitter, he has insulted 459 people, places, and things. And we're upset when Michelle Wolf calls Sarah Sanders a liar, which Sarah Sanders very definitely is, because, she lies and she echoes Trump's lies. And I don't think anybody would dispute that. I don't think Sarah Sanders could successfully dispute that. And now they're taking it a step up from that. And this is something that I'm very concerned about the ability of our nation to withstand. And that is they're actually questioning the patriotism of people with whom they disagree. Samuel Johnson, back in the 1700s, said, the last refuge of this, patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel. Sarah Huckabee Sanders said from the White House, from the press room, and I quote, "Look, at some point, Democrats have to decide whether they love this country more than they hate this president." Really? Sarah Sanders saying that Democrats hate the president and therefore don't love their country? I don't think either one of those statements are true. I think more Democrats are worried about the damage that Donald Trump is doing to our country than hate him. I don't hate him. Hell, I pray for the guy. But if he's damaging our country, if he is damaging our future, if questioning patriotism, oh, excuse me, this is something Sarah Huckabee Sanders said on Fox News. I said she said it from the White House. I lied. I was wrong. I didn't read the rest of the sentence. But still, she said it on Fox News, even worse, arguably. And then shortly after that, this is, by the way, from a piece by Aaron Blake on the 23rd of last month in the Washington Post. It's titled, "The Trump White House has turned questioning patriotism into a talking point." How do we survive this? The National Republican Senatorial Committee, the NRSC, issued a news release titled "Party Before Country" and said Democrats are taking party before country to a new level. In other words, if you disagree with Trump on Pompeo, then you hate your country. Sarah Sanders, she said, you know, Democrats who failed to applaud during Trump's State of the Union address were putting party above country. Trump suggested that those Democrats who didn't applaud him were guilty of treason. And the White House said, oh, it was just a joke. Right, but Michelle Wolf can't tell jokes, right? The White House Correspondents Association has to throw itself on the floor and beg the forgiveness of the right-wingers who were offended, which is pathetic. That, by the way, is the thing that's going to kill the White House Correspondents Association. And then Trump says, Democrats certainly didn't seem to love our country very much. And then Trump's campaign released an ad calling the Democrats' behavior disgraceful and they are disrespecting our country. Excuse me, dissent is not disrespect. Dissent is actually respect. It's caring about your country. It's believing in your country. And now the lies are going to another level. Now you've got Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, and Donald Trump and his administration lying about Iran and getting called on it. And the New York Times today saying that as of yesterday, Donald Trump has lied in office more than 3,000 times.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
In fact, they list the lies, or at least the largest category of the lies. I printed it out, and in tiny type, 6 or 7-point type, it's 13 pages. And welcome back. What a day. What a day. This is incredible stuff. Rich in Greenwood, Indiana. Rich, you're on the air. Thanks for watching Free Speech TV.
You're welcome, sir, and thank you for such a great job that you do. I'm going to play catch-up because I called in before you brought Ms. Wolf's comedic aspects into the conversation. Everybody must see her bit, Nice Lady. I got to see it on HBO. I'm assuming that they've got it in archives.
Wait a minute, she has a show called Nice Lady? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's her like hour-long show of her stand-up, and she is so good. Yeah. I mean, she is smart like nobody's ever been smart. She is brilliant like nobody's ever been brilliant
So
in
she's this generation's George Carlin, is that what you're saying?
I am. I absolutely am. And here's something to get on back to that as shoulders that we all stand on here as we try and make sense with satire. George Carlin had his 7 dirty words, and a reasonable fill-in that's FCC compliant is foo, F-O-O. So if you go back to Lenny Bruce and you say you got to be allowed to say foo, because if you can't say foo, then you can't say foo the government. And foo is this super important aspect of calling into question the status quo. Is it just? Is it right? And we must be willing to have satire to point things out to us that we may have let slide.
Yeah. We
may have been lazy about. They always say, it's funny because it's true. And, therein is the basis. I'm trying to think who is credited with the statement, you better make them, if you're going to tell people the truth, you better make them laugh first, otherwise they might kill you. Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde is attributed to have said that.
What a great quote.
So I think that's where I want to quit, because if I try to do more, I might diminish how brilliant I think that she is and how wondrous a talent and how fortunate we are to have her.
So, Rich, if I want to watch Michelle Wolf's, what did you say, good woman?
Nice nice lady.
Nice lady. Okay, if I want to
She's
watch
a
Nice
nice
lady,
lady.
do I go to HBO on demand and pull it up, or is it on Netflix?
Could
or
be. That'd be some sense that I understand with their advertising of how you get at stuff that's not currently in rotation.
Right, but it's an HBO product.
Correct. I saw it on HBO, and
when did she do this?
it was this year. I think it may have been recorded in February, and I was looking at it in March, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a woman who has a hell of a career ahead of her. If her reputation and career were not damaged by the White House Correspondents Association's apology and everything, I mean, there was a comedian who did a roast of George W. Bush, and I'm trying to remember what his name was, but it really ultimately seemed to have damaged his career, or his career kind of paused after that. And I hope that that's very much not the case with Michelle Wolf.
Well, let us come to her aid here. Let us recognize how fantastic she is.
Yeah.
She is good, and she is true, and she is a gadfly in the very best way.
Cool. I will check it out. I will check it out. It's Sean says it's on YouTube. You can actually find it on YouTube. So, Rich, thanks a lot for that. I appreciate it. And Sean, email it to us all, and we'll all watch it tonight. We'll be right back. It's 21 minutes past the hour. Donald Trump has told, according to today's Washington Post, has told 3,001 lies as of today. It's really pretty astonishing. And you go through these claims, most repeated claims. These are the things he's lied about more frequently. We're having a stock market just like they've never had before. Well, no, it's been repeated many. We've had stock markets very much like the stock market many times. In Wisconsin, I was very instrumental in getting Foxconn to come. They make the iPhones. They're an incredible company. Right. Actually, Foxconn started this back, a couple of years ago, before Trump. We have the biggest tax cut in history, bigger than the Reagan tax cut, bigger than any tax cut. These are lies. His tax cut is 0.9% of GDP. Reagan's tax cut was 2.89% of GDP. It was the one that really kneecapped the economy. Trump's tax cut is the 8th largest tax cut. It's smaller than the 2 tax cuts that Barack Obama passed, which, by the way, both benefited working people more than they did billionaires. His new thing, unemployment rates for Hispanics. We have the lowest level ever recorded. Unemployment for women. For women, lowest level in 18 years. Right. Not so true, according to the Washington Post. The fact checks, this is the problem. The fact checks are longer than the lies, and that's why, by and large, when Trump lies, they'll simply, run a headline that says, in misleading claim, or something like that. But when the lies become really consequential, and this is the big one, you know, I was talking about Netanyahu, and Netanyahu has figured out that if you want to influence Donald Trump, you don't need to fly to Washington, D.C. and give him a shoulder massage and let him flick dandruff off your shoulder. In fact, that might even be counterproductive, as Angela Merkel found out. Instead, what you have to do is get on television, specifically on Fox News. And if you can get on television with charts and pictures and visual aids, and this is what the CIA has learned, right? They've gone from 30, 40-page intelligence briefings for the president that were all text to 5 pages with accompanying pictures, and all in bullet points. Because his attention span is so compromised. I mean, he's got the attention span of a 10-year-old. So the challenge here is dealing with this truth-free environment. Netanyahu has figured out that he can manipulate Trump if he goes on TV. So Netanyahu does a TV performance in which Netanyahu basically lies. Now, I'm sure that every word that Netanyahu said was technically true, but the way that they were strung together causes people to think that the Iranians are currently cheating on the nuclear deal, which they are not. And in fact, Trump watched Netanyahu's performance, and then the White House came out and said, and I quote, that Iran has a robust clandestine nuclear weapons program. And then Peter Alexander and others, Peter works for NBC News, pointed out to the White House that that's not what Netanyahu said. He didn't say that they have a robust program. He said they had one back before the deal. In other words, Netanyahu's presentation would actually be a strong argument for the Iran deal, because he was talking about how terrible the Iranians were before the deal was signed. He didn't talk at all about how, what they're doing now, but left the assumption that that's what they're doing now. And that's the assumption that Trump took and tweeted and is proposing for policy. It's an excuse to attack Iran when it's a lie. Now, the White House had to correct this, and they're now blaming a, quote, clerical error, and that it was a mistake. We meant to say that the Iranians had a robust military program, not has. So somebody at the White House has corrected the lie. But I guarantee you, once Trump gets a lie in his head, this is the problem with pathological liars. He believes it. It's like my dad when I was a kid. He always said, don't tell lies. It's too hard to remember them. Well, if you believe them to be true,
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
So we have a pathological liar in the White House. He has surrounded himself with pathological liars and sycophants. How do we deal with this? The Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. This is an 1856 first English translation edition of this author. And but you can still get it online. A lot of different booksellers sell it. This is from chapter 11. What sort of despotism democratic nations have to fear? I had remarked during my stay in the United States that a democratic state of society similar to that of the Americans might offer singular facilities for the establishment of despotism. And I perceived upon my return to Europe how much use had already been made by most of our rulers of the notions, the sentiments, and the wants engendered by this same social condition for the purpose of extending the circle of their power. This led me to think that the nations of Christendom would perhaps eventually undergo some sort of oppression like that which hung over several of the nations of the ancient world. But it would seem that if despotism were to be established among the democratic nations of our days, it might assume a different character, different from the Roman Empire, for example. It might be more extensive and more mild. It would degrade men without tormenting them. I do not question that in an age of instruction and equality like our own, sovereigns might more easily succeed in collecting all political power into their own hands and might interfere more habitually and decidedly within the circle of private interests than any sovereign of antiquity ever could do. But the same principle of equality which facilitates despotism tempers its rigor. When no member of the community has much power or much wealth, tyranny is, as it were, without opportunities or a field of action. As all fortunes are scanty, the passions of men are naturally circumscribed, their imagination limited, their pleasures simple. This universal moderation moderates the sovereign himself and checks within certain limits the inordinate stretch of his own desires. Independently of these reasons, drawn from the nature of the state of society itself, I might add many others arising from causes beyond my subject, but I shall keep within the limits I have laid down to myself. Democratic governments may become violent and even cruel at certain periods of extreme effervescence or of great danger. Excuse me, think of George Bush and 9/11. But these crises will be rare and brief. When I consider the petty passions of our contemporaries, the mildness of their manners, the extent of their education, the purity of their religion, the gentleness of their morality, their regular and industrious habits, and the restraint with which they almost all observe in their vices, no less than in their virtues, I have no fear that they will meet with tyrants in their rulers, but rather guardians. I think then that the species of oppression by which democratic nations are menaced is unlike anything that ever existed before in our world. Our contemporaries will find no prototype of it in their memories. I am trying myself to choose an expression which will accurately convey the whole of the idea I have formed of it, but in vain. The old words, despotism and tyranny, are inappropriate. The thing itself is new, and since I cannot name it, I must attempt to define it. I seek to trace the novel features under which despotism may appear in the world. The first thing that strikes the observation is an immutable multitude of men, all equal and alike, incessantly endeavoring to procure the petty and paltry pleasures with which they glut their lives. Think now of a television society. Each of them, living apart, is as a stranger to the fate of all the rest. His children and his private friends constitute to him the whole of mankind. As for the rest of his fellow citizens, he is close to them, but he sees them not. He touches them, but he feels them not. He exists, but in himself and for himself alone. And if his kindred still remain to him, he may be said at any rate to have lost his country. Above this race of men stands an immense and tutelary power, which takes upon itself alone to secure their gratifications and to watch over their fate. Facebook? That power is absolute, minute, regular, provident, and mild. It would be like the authority of a parent if, like that authority, its object was to prepare men for manhood, but it seeks, on the contrary, to keep them in perpetual childhood. It is well content that people should rejoice, providing that they think of nothing but rejoicing. For their happiness, such a government willingly labors, but it chooses to be the sole agent and only arbiter of that happiness. It provides for their security, foresees and supplies their necessities, facilitates their pleasures, manages their principal concerns, directs their industry, regulates the descent of property, and subdivides their inheritances. What remains but to spare them all the care of thinking and all the trouble of living? Thus, it every day renders the exercise of the free agency of man less useful and less frequent. It circumscribes the will within a narrower range and gradually robs a man of all the uses of himself. The principle of equality has prepared men for these things. It has predisposed men to endure them and oftentimes to look on them as benefits. I have always thought that the servitude of the regular, quiet, and gentle kind, which I have just described, might be combined more easily than is commonly believed with some of the outward forms of freedom, and that it might even establish itself under the wing of the sovereign of the people. Our contemporaries are constantly excited by two conflicting passions. They want to be led, and they wish to remain free. As they cannot destroy either one or the other of these contrary propensities, they strive to satisfy them both at once. They devise a sole, tutelary, and all-powerful form of government, but elected by the people. They combine the principle of centralization and that of popular sovereignty. This gives them a respite. They console themselves for being in tutelage by the reflection that they have chosen their own guardians. And it continues. It's a brilliant book, A Democracy in America.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Well, Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. What do we do when our president is a pathological liar? I don't think we've ever had this problem. Richard Nixon knew when he was lying. He was willing to lie, but he knew when he was lying. And maybe Trump knows when he's lying. But his ability to remember his lies over time. I was telling you this story about my dad when I was, when we hit the break, and I just want to elaborate on it, and then I'll pick up your phone calls here. When I was a kid, I remember so clearly, I was probably 7, 8 years old, my dad saying, don't ever lie. And I was like, well, of course not, and he'd say, almost like a punchline, he says, the reason you don't want to lie, the main reason you don't want to lie is because it's so hard to remember your lies, and you will get caught in those lies. And I'm like, oh. And, throughout my childhood, I noticed how true it was. That if I lied about something, I had to remember what both the truth was and what my lie was. And that was a real challenge. And after a week or two, one of two things would happen. Either the lie would become the truth, which over time I discovered was really not useful, or I would forget the lie and slip the truth. And my dad was absolutely right. But I'm not sure that rule, that my dad's rule, applies to pathological liars, because I think the key to the pathology is that the part of the brain that says, yes, this is true, simply latches on to the lie. And that's why, if you look through this list on the Washington Post of the 3,000 lies that Donald Trump has told since he became president, you'll find that many of them have been repeated by Trump over and over and over again. In his Michigan speech, he told a couple of dozen lies. Just, the same night that Michelle Wolf said absolutely nothing that wasn't truthful. So what do we do about this? Omar in Herndon, Virginia. Hey, Omar, you have some thoughts?
Yes, Tom. I hope you don't mind me borrowing that story that with your dad. I'm going to use it. I'm going to tell my kid that same way. If you lie, you're going to have a hard time remembering your lie.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to borrow that from you.
It was great advice. Please do so.
It is great. What I wanted to say, I think the problem that I'm finding is the people who are surrounding him, people that are preparing speeches, people that are preparing talking points to Trump. I mean, they're also complicit in the lie. His whole campaign is a lie, you know? But my question to you, why do you think the Republicans keep allowing him to lie and just basically allowing him to do whatever he wants? Is it race? Is it because they're embarrassed to lose the White House? What is the core issue that his supporters and people in the Senate now?
That is such a great question, Omar. What is driving the Republican Party is money. And the money is coming principally from industries that essentially are destroying us, from the fossil fuel industry that is polluting the planet, from the banking industry that is ripping off the middle class, and particularly ripping off working people, poor people, the working poor, low-income people, the payday loan industry, which should not even exist, the student loan industry, which, is enslaving our kids with student debt, or at least destroying I shouldn't use enslaving, that's too strong a word, but tying them down for the first 20, 30 years of their lives so they can't get married, they can't buy homes, they can't do anything. I mean, you've got a bunch of industries that are pouring money into the election of Republicans because Republicans are willing, and we know this from the tobacco industry too. Mike Pence in 2000 saying, there's no evidence that tobacco causes cancer. The Republicans are willing to lie in exchange for money, and they're willing to legislate in ways that damage people in exchange for money, and then they use that money to maintain their power, and then they use the power to maintain their income. So you've got Scott Pruitt now, paying off, using campaign donations to his congressional campaign to pay off personal debt. And I mean, there's a piece in the New York Times about this a couple days ago. And so what's happening is you've got a donor class that is also willing to lie. There's a whole separate story out there that I was going to get into today about how the Koch brothers are making hiring and firing decisions, or at least the people associated with their right-wing foundations are making, according to the reporting in the media now, are making hiring and firing decisions, not just at the University of Miami, but at George Mason University as well, and presumably at many other colleges where they've made multi-million-dollar donations and created seats for right-wing economists. So, this whole web of lies that is used to maintain an oligarchy, that is used to maintain the power and wealth of a very small elite, is essentially necessary to prevent any kind of populist backlash, to prevent any kind of Bernie Sanders revolution. And this is what they're doing. And so, and they're perfectly willing to put up with Trump, grabbing women by the crotch or lying about it, or Trump even lying us into another war. They were perfectly willing to let George W. Bush lie us into a war in Iraq. It made many of them far more profitable. So I think it's all about the money. Have I answered your question,
Yes.
Omar? Okay,
Yes,
great.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Okay, I got to move along. Thank you for the call. Scott in Alameda, California. Hey, Scott, what's up?
Hey, Tom. So, intersection of the White House Correspondents Association controversy and the Comey memos. Okay, one of the Comey memos was Trump trying to plug the leaks, and Comey suggests making an example out of somebody, putting a head on a pike, which sounds typically macho from an FBI guy. Okay.
Sure.
Trump said, saying maybe involve putting reporters in jail. They spend a couple days in jail, make a new friend, and they are ready to talk. This is a prison rape joke for journalists.
Right.
And to have the White House Correspondents Association roll over so fast is an outrage. And I think that this Comey memo, this particular memo, should have been second in line of importance to Trump asking Comey to let Flynn slide. So that should have been number one, obviously.
Right.
Obstruction of justice. Number two should have been going after the First Amendment by threatening to rape journalists.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why isn't this a bigger story?
Oh, and why isn't he condemning the murder of 9 journalists yesterday in was it Kabul or was I think it was in Afghanistan, and I mean this.
They target them.
Yeah.
Targeting them.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of the first indicators of a potentially tyrannical government is when they start specifically targeting the press. I mean, Nixon had his enemies list, and many of them were members of the press. It went beyond that, but it was principally the press. But he asked the IRS to audit some of them, but that was about as far as it went. Trump's talking about, hey, let's imprison them and make sure that they have, a nice time with Bubba and rape them. I mean, the fact that we use prison rape as a threat to begin with makes us unique among developed countries. It doesn't happen in most other developed countries.
Yeah.
This is something that third world countries do. This is what dictatorships do. It's bizarre. But Scott, excellent point. Very, very well said and well made. Paul in Oakland, California. Hey, Paul, your thoughts?
Hey, good morning, Tom. So dealing with a pathological liar. So I grew up in a large Midwestern Catholic family, maybe like you. Our father was bipolar and alcoholic, and he would tell us lies that were completely unbelievable. But we didn't take them seriously because we knew in the end he wasn't going to act on them.
Right.
I mean, for once, he told us we were all moving to Australia to raise emus. And, of course, that never came to be.
Right.
But with Donald Trump, we've made the imperial presidency. We've given this person all this power. The pitch man that the Republicans ran behind this time, they have to live with him now, and they can't control him.
Right.
So that's, a very dangerous aspect. You and me and people who live in the reality-based world, which Karl Rove coined, it befuddles us when we have to constantly deal with someone who's not going to agree to reality and constantly tell lies. So that's why the media has such a hard problem with dealing with someone like that. They didn't have experience doing it on this scale before.
That makes sense. And probably most of us did not have the experience that you had as a kid, Paul, growing up with a pathological liar as a father. That's got to be tough. But thanks for sharing your story with us and giving us some insight. I appreciate it. Morris in Long Beach, California. Hey, Morris. Thanks for listening to KPFK. What's up?
Professor, I think what we call a liar, they may not see it as lying, right? I know what Webster describes as lying, misrepresenting, you're saying it's not the truth. But they don't really see it as lying. They see it as winning. And the thing that really scares me the most is not the politicians lying, short of Jimmy Carter, who was probably the only man of Christ we've had as a president. All of them have crossed that line in terms of telling big fibs. But what's got my attention is Michelle Wolf. Her comments were very soft. I go back to when a guy named Rich Little, remember him, Professor? He got rich.
He roasted Reagan, didn't he?
Yeah, he got rich making fun of U.S. presidents, Richard Nixon,
Jerry Ford.
Who was the other? Johnson. Remember this one? Professor? I come here tonight because I have nowhere else to go.
Huh.
You remember that was Rich Little doing President Johnson.
Wow.
Listen, we got to be able to laugh at these guys. When they take that from us, we're in trouble.
Yeah.
Talk to you later.
Yeah, very, very well said. Thanks, Morris. Ronald in Land O'Lakes, Florida. Hey, Ronald, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom, thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
You know, we were all brought up knowing that, you know, if you tell a lie, it's hard to remember. Well, we learn from the so-called lies, and if we go back in history of all the lies that were told by all the different politicians and the Supreme Court and other people dealing with the Justice Department that back these lies, we can never, ever fix them. And that's the main problem that I see. How do you correct lies and make things right when you have the Supreme Court justices locally as well as federally backing those lies?
Yeah. I think, Ronald, that what we need right now is a Truth and Reconciliation Commission like South Africa had. We need a venue where people who have been associated with Donald Trump or George W. Bush, who were associated with torture, who were associated with the murder of American allies and you know, and well, just, you know, all across the world, whether it was the whole CIA torture thing or whatever. We need a venue, you know, where even corporate polluters can come forward and say, you know, yeah, we committed this crime, we did this lie, we did this whatever, and receive some measure of forgiveness, but in exchange for that, having to expose their lies, their perfidy, their you know, how they have damaged America. Ronald, thanks for the call, and thanks for the question. We need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I would be willing to forego the prosecution of many of these guys, from Trump to his billionaire backers, if they simply came clean. Not that I'm expecting that, but I'd be willing to do that. What about you?
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We'll be back with more of your calls, my thoughts, and the news of the day. How do we deal with a liar in the White House? Right after this. And welcome back. Carol in Monessen, Pennsylvania. Hey, Carol, thanks for watching Free Speech TV. What's on your mind?
Hi, thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I tweeted something to you this morning, and actually it's about ways to deal with a pathological liar. There are 20, actually it's about a malignant narcissist, okay, which is what I believe he is. I mean, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I've been doing some research. And the 20 traits of malignant narcissism are, first, a pathological liar.
Right.
And second, a contract breaker, things like that.
Oh, I read that link. Yeah, I saw your
you?
tweet this morning. There was a link in there to a website I didn't recognize, but I read it and thought the reason that I didn't use that on the air is there was so much stuff there. I thought this will suck up the whole half hour.
But boy, it's out of the 20 characteristics of a malignant narcissist, he has 18 of them in spades. I mean, it sounds like a description of Trump.
Yeah, well, he's mentally ill. I mean, that's...
Oh, yes.
And he was apparently made that way by his parents. I think that you can find a lot of the roots of his psychopathology in his childhood. But that doesn't mean that we should tolerate it.
Well, I personally don't believe he has any business being near the White House. I mean, it's really... There's nothing that we can do that's going to change him. Because you can't change these people, apparently.
No, especially when they're 70.
He tells you how to deal with them as best you can. But really, there's no way to change them. like Trump will use diversion. He'll make up new lies. He'll blame it on you. That's what they do. They break contracts. They say they're going to do one thing, then turn around and do the opposite.
Yeah.
And it's just, there's no way to deal with someone like this except to remove him.
Yeah.
Remove him.
Well, and that's the problem, is that if the Democrats take control of the House and not the Senate, and not 2/3 of the Senate, frankly, which is what is required for a conviction on an impeachment, then it's going to be a replay of the Clinton years. And Bill Clinton actually politically benefited tremendously from being persecuted and prosecuted.
Yeah.
And I think Trump will benefit too, as long as he's got Fox News and right-wing hate radio to back him up. As long as there is a media infrastructure, a propaganda infrastructure, which is all in on Donald Trump's lies, as long as Trump keeps using the EPA to destroy our air and water and increase the profits of the polluters, as long as Trump keeps using the Interior Department to sell off our public lands to polluting mining companies and things like that, as long as Trump keeps deregulating the banksters, there's going to be hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in support of him and his policies. And they don't care who he lies about. They don't care who we go to war with. They don't care what kind of damage he does to our country. They don't care what kind of example he's setting for our children. They just want to get richer.
Yeah, these people have no empathy, no compassion. And they don't see the world the way you and I or some normal person would see the world. They just don't.
Yeah.
And there's no way that I think, and no psychiatrist says you can change that. You can only try to deal with it. And as long as Fox News is out there doubling down on his lies, for God knows what reason, and the same with Congress, why? Why won't they stop this?
Well, Fox News is owned by a billionaire. I mean, everything Trump is doing helps the billionaire class. Everything he's doing. And
everything.
Yeah, I mean, right down to his misogyny. I mean, it's all supportive of the existing power structure. Carol, I got to run.
Read those things I sent you.
I will. I will. They'll make a great show tomorrow. Carol, thank you for the call. I appreciate it, and thanks for the tweet. We'll be right back. It's the True People's Media, talk media for the rest of us here at the Thom Hartmann Program, fair and only slightly unbalanced. Daryl in Denville, New Jersey. Hey, Daryl, what's on your mind today? Thanks for listening to SiriusXM.
Hey, Tom, how are you doing?
Great. What's up?
Yeah, just a couple of things. One is lying is one thing, but we have two problems with Trump. One is he's ignorant. The other is he's a liar. And, add to the list of, potential amendments to the Constitution, amendments to Article 2, Section 1. We have got to update our Constitution to reflect modern-day realities. We cannot have an ignorant president. We just can't. Someone who can be lied to so easily by people who want to manipulate our economy or manipulate our foreign policy. Just recently, there was a report that Donald Trump, once he saw that meeting with Kim Jong-un and the president of South Korea on the DMZ, he saw the pageantry of that and decided that he wanted that photo op, regardless of how it was going to impact this deal with North Korea. He wanted the photo op. He wanted to have pictures of himself on the DMZ with all the pomp and circumstance that goes along with it, just to feed his ego.
Yeah.
He doesn't care what impact that's going to have on our national security, on our foreign policy. He just doesn't care. And to compare him with Nixon, Nixon was a liar. That's true. But, you can make an argument that at least Nixon cared about the country. He may have been a criminal. He may have been a liar. But he did care somewhat about the security of this country. And Donald Trump doesn't care anything about the security of this country. He doesn't care about our values. He doesn't care about our institutions. He doesn't care about any of it.
Yeah. So it seems, Daryl, and not only he doesn't care, but those parts of our institutions and our values that serve as a check on billionaire power, Donald Trump actively, aggressively dislikes. So I would take it even a step beyond that. Daryl, well said. Brad in Elk Grove Village, Illinois. Hey, Brad, thanks for listening to CPT. What's up?
Hey, here's the thing. I think there are a lot of people that are sociopaths in our society, and part of it is the greed factor that capitalism has created.
Right.
Unfettered capitalism. It's just after money, and there's no conscience. There's no conscience. There's no morality. People are indifferent to other people suffering because they want more.
Yeah. I agree, and that sociopathy is making its way into our culture, and now it's in the White House.
And the thing is, that leads more people. You're going to have that 30%. They're the ones that remind me of the torchbearers in the streets and the lines of people in the SS lined up in Nuremberg.
Yep. In 1937.
And Trump, David Bowie called Hitler the first rock star. And that's exactly what Trump is going for.
Yeah, I cannot disagree with anything you said, Brad. Andrew in Columbus, listening to WGRN. Hey, Andrew, what's up?
This is Steve in Santa Fe.
Oh, I'm sorry. Huh. Wonder how that happened. So what's up, Steve?
Thanks for taking my call, Tom, and doing what you do. I really get tired of the lies that have been corrected on the media, even on NBC News, where they say, no, we didn't give Iran $150 billion.
Right.
That one is really an old one, money that we froze and then gave back to them. That was their money. And the other one is that Hillary sold uranium to Russia. Do you know there's people that still believe that one?
Oh, sure.
Probably
the majority of Republicans.
A license to sell uranium to any other country, let alone one that's a mining company in Canada provides. I mean, I don't... Right. Do people not have the time to take a few minutes and fact check?
There are still people who think that Hillary Clinton was responsible for the death of people in Benghazi, when it was the Republicans who refused the State Department's request to increase security because they didn't want to increase the appropriation.
Yeah, and selling children to labor.
What do you mean?
I remember that one, too. And then today, to top it all off, what does Mitt Romney say? Talk about a liar. He says he praises Trump, saying that he's doing everything that he would do if he'd gotten in office.
Well, that's because Romney has got to run in a primary in Utah to run for the Senate.
Well, that's what I mean. Right now, it's like if you're a Republican and anything contradicts the Republican Party, you won't be a part of that party. You have to back anybody who's a Republican statements. You have to back them.
Yeah, and this is much like the case with the Nazi Party in Germany in the mid-30s. I mean, this is very, very concerning. Andrew, well said. Thank you very much for the call. We're going to continue our conversation and expand it somewhat. If you work, should you be poor? Peter Ferrara up next.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the organic wine company, ecowine.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally.
Call 800-568-9889 or go to tomsbeets.com. That's 800-568-9889, Tom's Beets, THOMSBEETS.com. It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Travis Lupik's book, Fighting for Space, how a group of drug users transformed one city's struggle with addiction. This is from the introduction. In a beat-up old hotel, Mark Townsend watched one of his tenants, a woman named Mary Jack, crawl up the stairs, so crippled by the symptoms of withdrawal that she couldn't lift her body to walk. It was 1992, Townsend recalls, and doctors required a thorough examination and patient history before they would prescribe methadone to someone addicted to drugs. Often that took several days. How can we make this woman's life bearable, he remembers thinking. The rules were wrong, Townsend decided. He found a doctor who put Mary on methadone immediately. They broke the law. That still didn't solve Mary's addiction to heroin. She would struggle with that for many years, but they addressed her immediate pain and made her well enough to fight another day. Like Townsend, activists, healthcare workers, and some politicians in cities across America are realizing that they will have to break and rewrite the rules on how society addresses addiction. The continent is in the grips of an overdose epidemic. In 2016, there were an estimated 64,000 fatal drug overdoses across the United States, up from fewer than 15,000 20 years earlier. Roughly 75% of 2016 deaths were attributed to heroin and similar drugs like OxyContin and fentanyl. For people under the age of 50, an overdose associated with an opioid is now the #1 cause of death in the United States. Heroin has reached the middle class and suburban America. At the same time, public opinion is turning against the war on drugs. Many policymakers are beginning to look at addiction as a healthcare issue as opposed to one for the criminal justice system. One Canadian city has seen this sort of crisis before. In response, a grassroots group of drug addicts waged a political street fight for 2 decades to transform how Vancouver treats its most marginalized citizens. Beginning in the early 1990s, activists pushed the city to adopt a 4-pillars approach to addiction. Authorities would continue with the pillars of prevention, treatment, and enforcement, but also deploy a series of complementary programs described as harm reduction. The city defined it like this: the principles of harm reduction require that we do no harm to those suffering from substance addiction, and that we focus on the harm caused by problematic substance use rather than substance use per se. In Vancouver, the municipal government accepted that it could not immediately help every addict stop using drugs. Therefore, for those people who fail to get clean or who are simply not ready for that step, it would attempt to make drug use less harmful. Inherent in harm reduction is an understanding that it is not necessarily the drugs themselves that do the most damage to the users. The law and systems of prohibition, which make drug procurement and possession illegal, are what hurt the people the most. When a person addicted to cocaine injects with a dirty needle, it's not the cocaine that poses a risk of infectious disease, it's the syringe. So why not make a clean needle available? Yes, the risk of overdose remains, as does the much larger issue of addiction itself, but the potential harm of an infectious disease is removed. When someone uses heroin in an alley, hurriedly injecting for fear of police, it's not the drug that causes them to rush and miscalculate their dose, possibly leading to an overdose. It's their fear of persecution. If they were offered an injection site where they could take their time and use under the observation of healthcare professionals, the risks would be reduced. Again, the addiction remains, but if they overdose at an injection site and a nurse is there to monitor them, they live to make another attempt at long-term treatment. Harm reduction strategies are about keeping people alive and as healthy as possible. excuse me, until they can arrive at a place in their lives where treatment or abstinence works for them. Today, there are dozens of cities across North America at the point where Vancouver was in the 1990s. Toledo, Miami, and San Francisco, for example, have sprouted activist groups that are working with healthcare professionals to slowly warm public opinion to this issue. 90% of new heroin users are white. A rising number are middle class or wealthy, a U.S. official told Frontline on PBS in 2016. Quote, "It's been true throughout American history that when drugs penetrated into the middle class, the white middle class, politicians panic much more than they do when the drugs are concentrated in poor neighborhoods. It's not fair and it's not right, but that is the kind of country we are living in." Jurisdictions across the United States are looking to Vancouver's example with increasing interest. One of the founders of Vancouver's harm reduction movement, Mark Townsend, spent April 2016 in New York helping that city expand needle exchange programs. In October 2016, a delegation from Seattle visited North America's, excuse me, visited North America's first supervised injection facility, Insight, in Vancouver. In early 2017, former BC coroner and Mayor Larry Campbell was in Sacramento helping lawmakers draft notices that would allow for the establishment of supervised injection facilities in California. Interest in Vancouver's model has grown with the increasing severity of America's opioid problem. This book, Fighting for Space, is about people who have slipped through the cracks. It's about those who have suffered the consequences of addiction and prohibition and who did not have family or friends to help them get back up. It's about those who, for a myriad of reasons, failed with treatment and rehabilitation. It tells their stories and explains harm reduction for communities that are struggling with overflowing jails, crimes fueled by desperation, and people left to die in the streets. Fighting for Space by Travis Lupick.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
So in the previous hour, I was, I mentioned my dad and how when I was a kid, he of course, for me and my three brothers, inculcated a sense of fairness and honesty. I mean, the importance of not lying obviously was first framed in a moral context, and then he said, and practically speaking, don't tell lies because it's hard to remember them, which stuck with me. And the other thing about my dad is that, when he dropped out of college in his second year, he was on the GI Bill after coming back from World War II. But he dropped out of college because Mom got pregnant with me, and he went to work in a steel mill in Grand Rapids. And ultimately, for a couple of years, when I was a little kid, and I remember this well, was selling encyclopedia, World Book encyclopedias and Rexair vacuum cleaners door to door, and we were living very frugally. Having to go to, we called it the cheese store, the surplus store every week to get our, 10-pound bag of dried milk and 10-pound block of processed cheese and the 25-pound bag of macaroni. I hate macaroni and cheese to this day. You ate it for a year, half our dinners. But then he got a good union job in a tool and die shop and worked there for 40 years. And he was able to raise 4 kids and put them through school and take a vacation every year and buy a new car every year and do good by my mom, who got a good pension and who actually survived him for a number of years. They're both passed now. Because the American dream back then was, one person working one job 40 hours a week would have time for the weekends for their kids, would have time in the evening, would have, could produce a middle-class job. And, there are many of us who believe that that Reaganomics has destroyed that with, massive tax cuts at the top, and the destruction of unions and the elimination or the freezing of the minimum wage for almost a decade, that, it's very hard today with one person working to actually not be in poverty. Peter Ferreira is with us, a senior fellow with the Goodman Institute for Public Policy Research, and formerly with he was a senior staff member of the White House Office of Policy Development, Associate Deputy Attorney General of the U.S. from 91 to 93. author of numerous books dealing with economics and the law. Peter, welcome back to the program.
Glad to be here.
And I should add, you can be tweeted at Peter Ferrara #1, Peter Ferrara 1, and Goodman, INST for Goodman Institute. GoodmanInstitute.org is the website. So, Peter, if I get this right, if I understand right the press release here I got on your study, it's that if you work full-time, it's impossible to be poor. How do you square that with $7.25 an hour?
Okay, because under current law, the minimum wage plus the earned income tax credit plus the child tax credit equals or exceeds the poverty line for every possible family combination. So one working mother and one child, one working mother and two children, one working mother and three children, a couple and one child, couple with two children, couple with three children. You will go through all the combinations. The study goes through those, and it shows how it adds up. It equals or exceeds the poverty line for every possible family combination. Not just the minimum wage, but the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit in addition.
Wow, this sounds like a punitive mistake that we should correct. I assume you're not arguing that all of those various combinations working a 40-hour week at $7.25 an hour, which is, I can't do the math that fast in my head, but I'm guessing you already know how much money that is per week or per month, that those people do not have a lifestyle that you would call middle class. I mean, are you arguing that it's time to raise the definition of how much money puts a person in poverty?
I'm not arguing it's middle class. I'm arguing it equals or exceeds the federal poverty line. That's all I'm arguing in that.
So then shouldn't we raise the federal poverty line so that those people would be eligible for benefits?
No, I think we should declare victory on poverty, and we should focus on getting people into work. Now, I learned something from an earlier interview by you. You advocated the government should just guarantee a job for everyone.
Yeah, I do.
And now, lately, I've been writing articles, and I've been taking that same position. The government should say, if you show up by 9 o'clock, we will assign you to if we can't find you a private sector job, like a temporary agency, for the day, we'll guarantee you an assignment doing something, and we'll pay you in cash at the end of the day. And you can get the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit on top of that. And so I advocate reforms along the 1996 reforms, block granting all the federal welfare programs back to the states, have states run these work programs, assuring that there will be a place where anybody can go on any given day and be assured of, getting a work assignment, getting paid in cash at the end of the day. And if they need more money, they can just come back tomorrow and do it again. And so it's actually a permanent solution to poverty, actually.
Yeah, and you point out
class for everybody.
Yeah, you point out in your study, if I may, Peter, that the federal government is spending about $1 trillion a year on 200 means-tested programs. If we simply gave that money to the poor, it would amount to $20,000 per person per year, or $80,000 for a family of four. I don't disagree, and I think it's bizarre that we have all of these programs that are basically subsidies to low-wage employers. The vast majority of workers in this low-wage economy, people who work at McDonald's, people who work at Walmart, are eligible or are on federal and state assistance programs because their wages are so low. And McDonald's and Walmart and other companies like them love this. They want this to stay this way. They want to maintain these programs because they're low-wage employers' subsidies. So if we were to say, we're going to eliminate all the welfare programs, we're going to create a federal guarantee of a job, and we were to adjust and these are the two steps that I'm guessing you're not willing to take. If we were to raise the definition of the poverty level to a point where when you're no longer in poverty, you actually can provide for your family the way my dad did when I was a kid, number one. And number two, we make the government the employer of last resort at a fair or a living wage rather than at the minimum wage, which I guess suggests that we raise the minimum wage by at least $4 or $5 an hour. Then we could have an economy that pretty much works for everybody.
Well, I'm not sure about all this other stuff. My study just goes as far as it goes. It just goes as far as it goes.
Yeah.
And it says that if you just guarantee a work assignment to everybody.
But why, as a conservative, do you want to subsidize Walmart with your tax dollars?
It's similar to Reagan's concept of workfare, and it actually eliminates poverty in America. So I think, that's a huge accomplishment in and of itself.
Well, when FDR did the WPA and the CCC, he was paying, the first minimum wage came along with FDR too, but they paid a lot more than the FDR, or a lot more than the minimum wage. And, we're both now calling for a return of federal job guarantees. Those job guarantees, it seems to me, should be at a decent wage. And if we were to do away with many of these programs, I mean, you're calling for doing away with the social safety net, you're going to have to raise the floor that people are falling from into that safety net, to the point where, or raise the social safety, raise what is replacing the social safety net, which is the job program, raise that to the point that people can reasonably expect to live.
Well, we can have that argument. I
think we are.
I can't get conservatives to go there. They're skeptical enough as it is with any kind of work guarantee. What I'm trying to do is get conservatives to see how similar a guaranteed job paying at least the minimum wage is to Reagan's workfare program.
Yeah.
And if I can get them to agree to that, that's as far as they're already skeptical of that as it is. I can't get them to go on and guarantee, a middle class income and all this other stuff.
Yeah.
This is just a solution for poverty. It's not a solution for the entire economy. The economic growth is the solution for the entire economy. So we need the economy to be growing again like it was in the 1980s, and then that'll be prosperity.
Yeah, I think for that's almost another issue, which is, the foreign replacement of our workers with cheap foreign labor. But anyhow, Peter Ferrara, interesting conversation, Peter. Thanks for dropping by.
All right, thank you for having me on the show. Bye.
You can tweet him at Peter Ferrara, #1, GoodmanInstitute.org is the website. We'll be back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls after this. And welcome back, George in Portland, Oregon, listening on X-Ray FM. Hey, George, what's on your mind today?
Hi there. I just wanted to talk about the guy that was just on, and him and other conservatives that I've spoken to about these topics. They think that they can break it down into such simplistic terms and such simplistic numbers. For him to say that we should declare that we've beaten poverty, it's just absurd. I mean, I can't even understand why.
Yeah. You've got more than a third and less than a half, or fewer than a half, of Americans living in poverty, essentially. Which is pretty breathtaking.
And so how is that? How have we defeated poverty in any way, shape, or form? I don't want to personally attack the guy, but he comes across as so smug about it, and it's based on Reaganomics, which didn't work.
Yeah.
It doesn't work. So,
although I find it interesting that Peter is willing to embrace a guaranteed job. I'm guessing, though, that if the Republicans put it into place, they do it
I've never heard that
punitively.
one before.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to see that as well, and maybe we could improve our infrastructure while we're at it.
Yeah. Well, that's what FDR did. I mean, he built the Hoover Dam, he built all kinds of stuff, and built roads across America, built forests and parks, and yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, imagine if Donald Trump decided to embrace that concept. He could actually end up being an American hero. We may all love him.
It's not inconceivable. George, thanks for the call. Keith in Simi Valley, California. Hey, you wanted to disagree with me about payday lenders, Keith? Really?
Yeah, I had an actual experience, Tom, with payday lenders. I broke my leg real bad, no health insurance. I was down a year, lost my job. The whole story with that. Got a new job, driving an old car back and forth to work. Boom, the motor blows up. I have no money. All my friends are poor. They don't have any money. Payday lender was the only thing I'd do for $3,000. Got me a rental car, gave me the cash for the mechanic, got the engine off of eBay, saved my butt 300%.
How much did you pay in interest on that $3,000 loan?
It's like 300%.
So you paid $9,000 in interest on a $3,000 loan, and you're happy about that?
Here's the alternative. If I didn't do that over that year, I would have lost it. I would have been homeless.
Well, instead of loving payday lenders, Keith, you should be pushing for postal banking. I mean, we used to have this in this country.
Oh, I'm just for the economy and the setup we're in now. That's the only option I
know, and that's a crime. That basically a criminal enterprise. You know, Richard Nixon did away with the usury laws in the United States in '71, I believe it was. And up until that point in time, it was a crime to charge anybody more than 10% annual interest, period. Credit cards couldn't charge more than 10%. Mortgages couldn't be more than 10%. Nothing could be more than 10%. And those usury laws had been on the books since the 1930s. And Richard Nixon eliminated those laws to help out his bankster buddies. And now you're being charged 300% by payday lenders. Used to be the only people who did that were the mafia. Now the mafia is being put out of business by the payday lending industry. They are the modern mafia. And how anybody could think that that's like some sort of good thing or a blessing. I don't, you know, Keith, I'm just astonished. Thanks for the call. And I'm glad that you're on your feet again. But having to pay $9,000 in interest to take out a $3,000 loan for less than a year is criminal. And according to American law, prior to Richard Nixon, it was criminal. We'll be back. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Interesting piece by Eric Posner and Glenn Weil in the New York Times today. It's titled "The Real Villain Behind Our New Gilded Age." They start out with the joke that Chris Rock told. If poor people knew how rich people are, there'd be riots in the streets. And from there, they point out over the last 2 decades, growth rates in the U.S. have fallen to half what they were in the middle of the 20th century. The share of income accruing to the top of 1% has nearly doubled since the 1970s, while the share of income going to all workers has fallen by nearly 10%. Now, these, by the way, are features, not bugs, of Reaganomics. This is the way that Reaganomics is supposed to work. It creates oligarchy, and which is what we have, ruled by the rich. You've got 2 rich brothers saying, we're going to put $400 million into an election, and nobody's going, wait a minute, two fat cats, 2 of the richest guys in the world, are going to buy our elections? That's not right. No, everybody's going, oh, yeah, gee, well, I wonder what that's going to do. These, Posner and Weil write, are the marks of a new gilded age. And they say it's tempting to blame impersonal market forces like automation and globalization for this inequality, but the true villain is really simple: monopoly market power. And then they go on to point out that much like in the last gilded age, in the 1880s, 1890s, where you had the rise of monopolies, the oil monopoly, Standard Oil, the steel monopoly with Carnegie, the banking monopoly with Morgan. There were a whole series of monopolies that rose up. The Sherman Antitrust Act was passed in order to stop those monopolies, and it was implemented and used aggressively by Presidents Roosevelt and Taft in the 1900s and the 19-teens to break up these giant companies. Standard Oil was broken up into 28 separate companies. And they point out that this market dominance by a small number of companies is what makes it impossible to have wage competition among employers. That and the thing, you know, Jimmy John's was the first to get busted for this, but apparently it's a widespread practice in many low-wage industries, is to have employees sign a contract which says that they cannot go to work for a competitor. It's a non-compete clause in your contract. And if you've signed one of those employment contracts, then you literally can't look for another job that's similar to the job that you have, the job that you're qualified to do, the job that you've been trained to do. You can't use those qualifications or training. At the high end, we find that in the tech industry, you know, companies like Apple and Google and whatnot have had a policy for some time about not poaching each other's employees. Now, this is, you know, collusion and monopoly, and it's technically illegal. And it should be radically illegal. And they build this really strong case that everybody from groups like BlackRock and Vanguard, these giant investment companies that now own so much of some of the major players like the airlines, you know, the couple of investment companies own so much of the airline stock that, you know, they're able to vote in ways that would cause the airlines to continue behaving in ways that basically screw their customers and their employees. And they get rewarded for this by these hedge funds and by these investment companies. The increasingly low labor force participation, the rising deficits. They talk about, for example, several years ago, many farm equipment manufacturers merged, creating a handful of giant companies like John Deere. This in turn led to a smaller number of farm equipment dealerships. With fewer places to work, farm equipment mechanics had to either accept lower wages or find work in other fields. And then you've got this enormous market power like the tech titans, Google and Facebook specifically. And, you know, one of the questions I think that was asked of Mark Zuckerberg was, you know, when he was testifying before Congress was, you know, if I'm driving a Ford and I don't like the Ford and it's a clunker, I can sell my Ford and go buy a Chevy and say, you know, I'm just not going to buy Fords anymore. So if somebody's using Facebook and they don't like how you're using their information, and they don't like that you're selling their secrets, where's the alternative? Where else can they go? Nowhere. If somebody doesn't like Google, well, yeah, you can go to DuckDuckGo, but DuckDuckGo, you know, will give you a private search, but they're not going to, you know, provide you with free email. They're not going to, you know, do the operating system that runs your smart TV, which is, by the way, keeping track of everything you watch and giving that information back to the operating system, presumably to Google, via the Android operating system. I mean, it's like all of this stuff, all of these different dimensions all mean that basically the labor market is sewn up, the sales market is sewn up. You and I are going to be paying higher and higher and higher prices as time goes on, and in fact are. And we're going to be taking lower and lower wages. And the driving force behind this is market monopoly. And now we're looking at a political monopoly where a small group of right-wing billionaires own an entire political party and all the politicians in it, the Republicans. And that, you know, all of these monopolies, whether it's the political monopoly of the Republicans, whether it's the right-wing monopoly of the media, whether it is, you know, you name it, all of these work to screw average Americans.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
So if we want to fix this, we need some major structural reforms in this country. Major structural reforms. We'll be back. Today in the Thom Hartmann University Book Club, we're reading from Johann Hari's brand new book, Lost Connections, Uncovering the Real Causes of Depression and the Unexpected Solutions. So he starts out talking about how he had been on antidepressants for most of his life, from his teenage years into his 30s. And then he says, then when I was 31 years old, I found myself chemically naked for the first time in my adult life. For almost a decade, I had been ignoring my therapist's gentle reminders that I was still depressed despite my drugs. It was only after a crisis in my life, when I felt unequivocally terrible and couldn't shake it off, that I decided to listen to him. What I had been trying for so long wasn't, it seemed, working. And so when I flushed away my final packs of Paxil, I found these mysteries waiting for me, like children on a train platform waiting to be collected, trying to catch my eye. Why was I still depressed? Why were there so many people like me? And I realized there was a third mystery hanging over all of it. Could something other than bad brain chemistry have been causing depression and anxiety in me and in so many people all around me? If so, what could it be? Still, I put off looking into it. Once you settle into a story about your pain, you're extremely reluctant to challenge it. It was like a leash I had put on my distress to keep it under control. I feared that if I messed with the story I'd lived with for so long, the pain would be like an unchained animal and would savage me. Over a period of several years, I fell into a pattern. I would begin to research these mysteries by reading scientific papers and talking to some of the scientists who wrote them. But I always backed away because what they said made me feel disoriented and more anxious than I had been at the start. I focused on the work for another book, Chasing the Scream, the first and last days of the war on drugs instead. It sounds ridiculous to say I found it easier to interview hitmen for the Mexican drug cartels than to look into what causes depression and anxiety. But messing with my story about my emotions, what I felt and why I felt it, seemed more dangerous to me than that. And then finally, I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. So over a period of 3 years, I went on a journey of over 40,000 miles. I conducted more than 200 interviews across the world with some of the most important social scientists in the world, with people who had been through the depths of depression and anxiety, and with people who had recovered. I ended up in all sorts of places I couldn't have guessed at in the beginning. An Amish village in Indiana, a Berlin housing project rising up in rebellion, a Brazilian city that had banned advertising, a Baltimore laboratory taking people back through their traumas in a totally unexpected way. What I learned forced me to radically revise my story about myself, my story about the distress spreading like tar over our culture. I want to flag up right at the start 2 things that shape the language I'm going to use through all of this book. I'm reading from the introduction. Both were surprising to me. I was told by my doctor that I was suffering from both depression and acute anxiety. I had believed those were separate problems, and that is how they were discussed for the 13 years I received medical care for them. But I noticed something odd as I did my research. Everything that causes an increase in depression also causes an increase in anxiety, and the other way around. They rise and fall together. It seemed curious, and I began to understand it only when, in Canada, I sat down with Robert Kohlenberg, a professor of psychology. He too once thought that depression and anxiety were different things. But as he studied it for over 20 years now, he discovered, he says, that the data are indicating that they're not distinct. In practice, quote, the diagnoses, particularly depression and anxiety, overlap, end quote. Sometimes one part is more pronounced than the other. You might have panic attacks this month and be crying a lot next month. But the idea that they're separate in the way that, say, having pneumonia and having a broken leg are separate is not borne out by the evidence. Robert's side of the argument has been prevailing in the scientific debate recently. In the past few years, the National Institutes of Health, the main body funding medical research in the United States, has stopped funding studies that present depression and anxiety as different diagnoses. They want something more realistic that corresponds to the way people are in actual clinical practice, he explains. I started to see depression and anxiety as like cover versions of the same song by different bands. Depression is a cover version by a downbeat emo band, and anxiety is a cover version by a screaming heavy metal group. But the underlying sheet music is the same. They're not identical, but they're twinned. The second insight comes from something else I learned as I studied these 9 causes of depression and anxiety that he writes about in this book. Whenever I wrote about depression and anxiety in the past, I started by explaining one thing. I am not talking about unhappiness. Unhappiness and depression are totally different things. There's nothing more infuriating to a depressed person than to be told to cheer up or to be offered jolly little solutions as if they were merely having a bad week. It feels like being told to cheer up yourself by going out dancing after you've broken both your legs. But as I studied the evidence, I noticed something that I couldn't ignore. The forces that are making us depressed and severely anxious are, at the same time, making even more people unhappy. It turns out that there is a continuum between unhappiness and depression. They're still very different in the same way that losing a finger in a car accident is different from losing an arm, and falling over the street is different from falling over the cliff. But they are connected. The book, Lost Connections by Johann Hari.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Occupying the media 3 hours a day, 5 days a week. It's the Thom Hartmann Program, and that would be me, Mark, in Morrisville. Oh, I'm sorry. Mark in Morrisville, Pennsylvania. What's up, Mark?
Hey, Tom. I wanted to respond to the guest you had just a short while ago, who was claiming that that minimum wage and tax credits should effectively exceed bring somebody into out of poverty.
Right.
Having grown up most of my life on welfare when I was a child, and then a little portion of my married life. One of the things that I take umbrage with is the fact that the concept of a poverty line is arbitrary and is really just a reflection of the most conservative concept of what people deserve.
Yeah.
And in reality, a living wage should be the only measure of what people need to have in order to be to survive in a civil society. Right now, they just did a research project that showed that in all states in this country, you cannot make below $10 an hour and afford to house, clothe, and feed yourself.
Right. Yeah, I agree, Mark, and that's why I said, my response to Peter's statistics was that if what he's saying is true, that if a person works full time at the minimum wage and takes the child tax credit and takes the whatever it may be, and they're no longer under the poverty line, then we need to raise the poverty line.
I absolutely agree. I think that it should no longer be called the poverty line, and I think that we really have to start relying on a base living wage or base living income.
Yes.
And that really has to be measured against what it costs for basic housing, food, and clothing in
and
any state in this country.
And
health, absolutely, health care.
And maybe even education. But I'm with you, Mark.
I mean, I did some research years ago, and one of the things that I discovered is this concept of a corporate state that we live in is actually a complete anathema to what the founding fathers had originally intended with corporations in this country. They were initially thought to only exist short term as a means to help the working or labor class people get a foot up and be able to then do the same thing. They were actually initially intended to be short-lived because of the example set by the East India Trading Company.
Yeah, from the founding of the Republic until the 1880s, there was not a single state in the United States that allowed a corporation to live more than 20 years.
Exactly, and then at the dissolution, anything beyond the initial investment or lifetime profits of that company, all hard assets and any leftover means was to be distributed among the labor class that worked to give that company its existence and.
Well, I don't know of any specific state laws that said that, but basically people, the incorporators would have to reincorporate and basically buy their own shares or buy the assets of the company, and which was done regularly. I mean, there were ways around this. But they made it, in net, what it did is it made it harder for companies to become monopolies and to be as large and aggressive as they are. I agree that should be the case, that when a company is dissolved, the assets should be distributed to its employees. But to the best of my knowledge, that never happened. But it should.
And because of the loss of these basic principles, I mean, we've actually become a company nation, like the company, the company towns where essentially the companies decided how we would live, where we would live, how much money we would be allowed to have.
Which is the definition of fascism.
Indebted us by actual intent.
Yeah, the merger of corporate and state interests combined with belligerent nationalism, the definition of fascism. Mark, excellent points all. Yep. Thank you for the call. Larry in Aubrey, Texas. Hey, Larry, what's on your mind today?
Hey, the previous caller, again, that was talking about declare a victory on poverty. And he's, said, well, you have a single mother with one child, and she gets earned income tax credit and a child tax credit. I don't think you can get both of those. It's either one or the other, number one. Number two, who watches the kids while she does 40 or more hours a week of work?
Damn good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, damn good question. And all of these conservative pundits or all these conservative assumptions are that everybody's living in this nice little town where there's a big nuclear family all around, and everybody's willing to pitch in, and the church will support you when you're hungry or broke, and we just don't live in that country any longer. I'm not sure we ever did outside of some relatively small pockets of the United States. Excellent point, Larry. Thank you for calling and making it. Tom in Indianapolis. Hey, Tom, what's on your mind today?
Hey, love your show.
Thank
Damn
you.
it, love your show. I'm a son of a steel worker also. Victory over poverty is something called unions.
Yeah.
I worked in the steel mills. But, human nature is greed and power. And one of the things that destroyed the unions was themselves. They destroyed themselves by not being a partner with the American people. It's just like the auto workers. They were getting paid so much in excess of everybody else that they became part of the problem.
I strongly disagree, Tom. That is the sales pitch that you heard from the Reaganistas during the Reagan era when they were trying to destroy the unions. The unions built the American middle class. And this whole let's declare war on working people, Reagan program, the first step of it was to create jealousy between people who were unionized and non-unionized. And instead of telling people who were not unionized, who were working for crap wages, gee, you really should work to have a union job, they were telling them, you should be jealous of the guy with the union job. You should hate him. You should make him ashamed of how much money he's making when all he's doing is living a middle-class lifestyle. Tom, you've got the villain absolutely upside down. The villain are the companies and the billionaires who funded the right-wing think tanks and the Republican Party and the media to promote the ideas that you're promoting right now.
Well, I'm just giving an observation.
But you're wrong.
I have been, like I say, I've been in the mills. I've seen.
Do you think you earned too much, Tom?
I've seen people sleeping. I've seen the waste of time. But the other thing that you talk about is true. Reagan started all this, Clinton finished it, and Obama condoned it.
I can't disagree with that, Tom. I mean, the reality is that Reagan declared war on the unions. And you're right. Bill Clinton was not a friend of the unions in a big way. I mean, he supported unions, but trying to return them to the power that they had, trying to undo Reaganism, no, they didn't do that, and neither did the Obama administration. And that's all the more the shame. I mean, this is part of the whole third way thing, the whole neoliberal thing, the whole Democratic Leadership Council thing. That hey, we're going to become conservatives. We're going to become basically Eisenhower Republicans. And that's going to be the future of the Democratic Party. And it's not working out that well. In fact, the future of the Democratic Party is very much in doubt. As a consequence of that, people are very disillusioned, shattered by those kinds of policies. Howard in Coraopolis, Pennsylvania. Hey, Howard, what's on your mind today?
Well, it's been a long time. I can't remember.
It says here you wanted to talk about lying.
But anyways, I like the way you handled that last call. Franklin Roosevelt, I remember seeing on TV when his casket, after he passed away, came down, how many people on the streets were waving their handkerchiefs and how much he was loved.
People were sobbing. It was just like when Kennedy was assassinated. People were just shattered.
It was a big deal.
Yeah.
It was a big deal. And Reagan, I think he hated Roosevelt, and he tried to do everything he could to undo it, the New Deal, and now people are trying to name everything in the country after Reagan.
Yeah. Well, and let's not forget, I mean, prior to the 1950s, Reagan actually identified himself as a Roosevelt Democrat. And it wasn't.
I know that.
It wasn't until he married Nancy Davis.
He was the union president. For
Yeah, he was the president of the Screen Actors Guild in California, of the California division of the union. And yeah, he was using that position to feed information, to J. Edgar Hoover, but about communists in Hollywood. But he still was a Democrat, and he was, I've got an ad that he made for Hubert Humphrey in the 1942 election, I think it was, or maybe it was 52 election, but whatever year it was. And where Reagan is telling stories about how the Republicans are screwing the average working person. I mean, Reagan understood it, but then when he married Nancy Davis, her father said to him, Ronnie, if you want to be a good husband to my daughter, you need to get rich, and you're not getting rich doing this Democrat thing. And if you become a Republican, I'll get you into the General Electric Theater. We'll see your career take off, and you'll become a spokesperson for these Republican values and issues, and life will be good. And Ronnie took that advice. Ronnie did what Mr. Davis wanted, and sure enough, he became a rich guy. So
I learn something from you every day.
Yeah, well, thank you, Howard. But I mean, that's actually, and you wonder how many of these guys, in the Trump administration, for example, see, okay, I'll get on board with this program, whether it's Scott Pruitt or Ryan Zinke or any of these guys who were, struggling middle-class guys and became insanely wealthy. Paul Ryan became very, very rich because they decided that they were going to suck up to the oligarchs. They were going to go along with the program. They were going to do what the oligarchs, said that they should be doing. And, the consequence of that is the destruction of our country. Howard, thank you for the call. It's great to hear from you, and appreciate the call, thoughts, and the kind words. We're going to check in with Talk Media News in about 4 minutes. Stick around. We'll be back for that. And in the meantime, well, hang on. And back to my original question. How do we as a country recover from having a sociopath as president?
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archive.
I mean, a lot of companies have sociopaths as their CEOs. In fact, sociopaths are overrepresented in CEO positions. Now we've got one running our country. What do we do? And welcome back. Nicolas, am I saying that right, in San Cristobal, Mexico?
It's me, Tom. It's Nicholas. Hi.
Nicholas. Hey, Nicholas. Thanks for watching us on YouTube. What's up?
4 real quickies to go through about lying that I think are really sort of important. One, just the not-so-funny old African proverb, he who tells the truth will be the first one to be run out of the village. Always worth remembering. 2, your question about how do we deal with Trump having a pathological liar. I think there may be a bigger problem afoot. The American public itself has been lied to so long, for so many decades. It's multi-generational now. And I would say largely via television. Advertising is largely lies. The programming itself. I mean, who believed that the Cleaver family in Leave It to Beaver actually represented middle America? And yet people chose to believe it because it was comfortable. The third thing, quickly, is AMLO, the uber left presidential candidate down here. I got to hear 2 nights ago. He started off his entire speech to a massive crowd of cheering people. No more lying. Ya basta. Suficiente las mentiras. It was incredible.
Wow.
And then,
is he going to win?
Quickie, if you and Louise are ever in the neighborhood of South Mexico, you have a standing open invitation for what is really, frankly, a very lovely guest apartment, all your own. And
well, thank you, Nicholas.
Yeah. So if you want to shoot me back to Louise, I can give you info.
Yeah. Okay. And thank you for the offer. Where do you think that the Mexican? You're tuned into the Mexican politics. Where, their presidential election is in June, isn't it?
July 1st. Yeah.
July 1st. Okay. And I've been seeing articles suggesting that this leftist candidate might actually win. Do you think that that's possible?
Well, he's up by more than 20 points now.
Wow.
The lead is far too big to overcome. What we down here are all afraid of, do you remember a candidate named Colosio?
I don't.
The one they assassinated on television during an interview about 20, 25 years ago?
Yeah, no, I missed that. I'm not
he
a
was
student of
somewhat
Mexican
liberal,
politics.
nothing like AMLO is.
Yeah.
It's Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, AMLO for short.
Right.
He makes Bernie look like a Republican. I mean, this guy is so far left, he's fallen off the spectrum. And the people are wildly behind him. But the great fear is that he may be assassinated again, because the establishment, as you can well imagine, is running for its life at this point, and they're throwing tens of $millions to spread, here we go again, lies about the man.
Yeah.
But the people, fortunately, are not falling for it. So I don't know. We have to be hopeful, I guess.
What's the media scene like in Nicholas in Mexico? Do you have the Mexican equivalent of Fox News, an entire network devoted to the interests of the billionaire class?
No, interestingly, no. And there's no, not that I know of, there's no translated into Spanish Fox News down here. There is CNN Espanol, as you know,
sure,
which is quite liberal, liberal-ish.
Yeah.
No, the news reports fairly accurately on things. The press in Mexico is frankly more advanced than in the United States. People will find that hard to believe, but I've lived here 15 years, and I sort of know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I believe it.
Things are looking good. It's
cool.
kind of embarrassing. Mexico's ahead of the U.S. now.
Yeah, it is.
In this way.
Nicholas, thanks for the call, and thank you for the offer. I appreciate it. It's very considerate of you. We'll be back. We're going to check in with Talk Media News. Ellen Ratner will be with us in just a moment. Stick around. Welcome back to the place where smart people get their news. Speaking of which, both smart people and news. Let's check in with Ellen Ratner and find out what's going on in the world today. This report brought to you by goatsfortheoldgoat.com, Ellen Ratner's charity that works in South Sudan, which is where Ellen is right now, and loving what you do, Ellen's new book. Ellen Ratner, live from South Sudan. Hey, Ellen.
Well, hello. So the most interesting thing is what is now coming out about the quote-unquote leaked questions from Comey to the President of the United States.
Uh-huh.
And now they're saying because of the way the questions were asked, that they may have been a leak from President Trump and his side rather than from Comey's side, because they say that's not the way a lawyer would ask questions.
Right. They're apparently...
I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, apparently the Trump or his lawyers in their conversations with Mueller, it wouldn't have been Trump, but Trump's lawyers and people on his staff, Mueller's staff said, okay, here are the things we want to talk about. And obviously these were notes taken by somebody who was not a prosecutor and not a lawyer in the White House, because you're right. There were typos, there were errors of grammar, and there was sentence construction in a way that would not be done by a lawyer in a deposition or requesting information. So it's probably Trump was the leaker of this thing, this leak that he's screaming about right now.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
It's absolutely fascinating. Okay, next, as you know, my brother Michael, before he passed, was president of the Center for Constitutional Rights.
Right.
Well, the constitutional rights people tried to, the Center for CCR, as we call it, tried to get into Israel, and the head of it, who's essentially an attorney, but he's not president of the board, he's just a staff person, tried to get into Israel and was detained and questioned and then deported because of his work with the Palestinians.
Wow.
Now, next week, I'll be doing the show from Israel, so that should be very, very interesting.
Are you going to get to Gaza?
Well, I don't know. We'll see, right?
Yeah. Should be very interesting.
Okay. Now, yesterday, by the way, was the worst day in the world for journalists. In Kabul, Afghanistan, there was a man who blew himself up, and then 9 journalists, at least, more journalists, I think, went to the scene and were starting to report, and a second guy blew himself up, and 9 journalists were killed.
Right.
If you can believe it.
And this was targeted against journalists. So.
Oh, absolutely targeted at journalists. There's no question about that. One was the CNN guy.
Wow.
Okay, so yesterday, also in Jordan, was the new head of the State Department, and he was talking about Gaza. He said that Israelis have a right to defend themselves. He said that in a press conference. Then there was a conference.
I'm sorry, Ellen, your phone just broke up pretty badly. Could you repeat your last sentence or two?
Sure. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So yesterday,
basically what happened is, and now I lost my train of thought.
Yeah. No, you were talking
about
Jordan talking
Gaza.
about Israel and
Okay,
Gaza.
yes. Okay. So the head of Mike Pompeo, who is now the new Secretary of State, was giving a press conference, and he said Israel has a right to defend itself. Well, of course, that may be true, but a lot of people are saying what's going on in Gaza isn't fair to the Gazans either.
Right. Yeah, and shooting at these
So
people,
that is going on.
you know, as they're protesting seems bizarre in the extreme, and killing a bunch of them. I'm just astonished by what Israel's doing to the Gazans. It's just astonishing. Anyhow, back to you,
Well, you're
Ellen.
not the only,
Yeah.
for sure. A lot of people like me are.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's another thing that's going on, and yesterday Mike Pompeo was in Jordan when he said that Israel had a right to defend itself, and then the president held a conference at the White House with the president of Nigeria. And this was in the Rose Garden. He held a press conference, etc. And it's interesting, they talked about supposedly terrorism and all that kind of stuff. But then the president of Nigeria, interestingly enough, was held to task by none other than Congressman from New Jersey. And what basically happened with this is he said, hey, listen, you guys are going after Christians, and that's not fair. It's Chris Smith from New Jersey, who is a right-winger, but he's a friend of mine. And, you know, a stop clock is right twice a day, as I like to say.
So the Nigerians are going after Christians, and the government is, and persecuting them, and
well,
he
that is
called them out
what
for
Chris
this?
Smith is saying. That's right.
Wow. Wow. How did the president
And
of
he's
Nigeria
saying the
react?
president is talking about terrorism, but he's not doing anything about the Christians.
Right. Right. Terrorist against Christians. Amazing. What else is up?
Okay. Well, there's a lot going on. Today, the president is actually meeting. He's having a meeting with the people from the Southwest flight, and there's about 6 passengers that helped that woman who died, and they invited them to the White House as well. So the president is doing that. He also gave the Commander-in-Chief trophy out to to West Point. West Point won the Commander-in-Chief trophy. So that happened, and that is going on at the White House today. Now, also, this is really interesting. On Friday, both the vice president and the president are going to actually be speaking to the NRA in Dallas, Texas. That's the National Rifle Association. And the president, this is the 4th time in a row, the 4th year in a row that the president has actually spoken to them. Twice he was not president. This is the 2nd time as president of the United States that he is doing that.
And this is the NRA meeting where they have declared the conference a gun-free zone. And nobody seems to think that that's particularly weird.
I can't even, figure that out. The only thing I can think of is
Go ahead.
service is not allowing guns to be there.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that may be, but apparently they're declaring it a gun-free zone outside of the time when the president and vice president are there as well, which kind of smells of hypocrisy to me. Ellen Ratner with Talk Media News. Thank you, Ellen. Great talking with you, and keep safe in South Sudan. Say hi to anybody that we both know there. Thank you, Ellen.
Will do.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
From you.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, ecowine.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally.
Call 800-568-9889 or go to tomsbeats.com. That's 800-568-9889, Tom's Beets, THOMSBEETS.com. Go ahead.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6. You still on 10? In 10.
It's Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from a book edited by Rex Stout back in the 1940s. It's titled The Illustrious Dunderheads, and it's speeches given mostly by Republican congressmen in Congress, on the floor of the House and the Senate, talking about how we should not support England or Britain in their fight against Hitler, and how Hitler's a guy we can work with and all this sort of thing. If you saw the Churchill movie, Darkest Hour, this book will ring a lot of bells for you. It's out of print. There are used copies floating around. This is a copy my father gave me as a gift years ago. So, The Illustrious Dunderheads by Rex Stout. It's a collection of speeches, as I said. The first one is by George Bender, the Republican representative from Ohio. And this is July 11, 1940. I wish to call attention to the statement made by an expert, Colonel Lindbergh. Quote, "Let us not be confused by this talk of invasion by European aircraft. The air defense of America is as simple as the attack is difficult when the true facts are faced. We are in danger of a war today not because the European people have attempted to interfere with the internal affairs of America, but because American people have attempted to interfere with the internal affairs of Europe. Regardless of which side wins the war, there is no reason, aside from our own actions, to prevent a continuation of peaceful relationships between America and the countries of Europe." Then on September 3rd, 1940, he said, "Any device at all that suits the convenience of the president." Keep in mind, FDR was president, and the Republicans didn't want to fight against Hitler because they thought it would get FDR elected for a third term as a wartime president. That was what this was all about. "Any device at all that suits the convenience of the president is used in order to get us into this war by the back door. The power of peacetime conscription in the hands of an administration that is proved by its record to have used every conceivable excuse for regimenting America, overturning all tradition, and changing our form of government is nothing but an invitation to disaster. We know that our people hate everything that Hitler stands for. We despise dictatorship in any form, but I challenge anyone to tell us the difference between executive orders issued by Roosevelt and those issued by Hitler." Republicans in 1940. But wait, there's more. This is from Hamilton Fish, Republican representative from New York State. This is June 22nd, 1940. "Colonel Lindbergh was right when he said in one of his recent speeches, 'Let us stop this hysterical chatter about calamity and invasion that has been running rife these past few days. It is not fitting to the people who built this nation. The only reason we are in danger to becoming involved in this war is because there are powerful elements in America who desire to take part in a war against Hitler.'" Then on June 22nd, 1940, he gave a speech at the House of Representatives. He says, "Let us have an end to the secret diplomacy and the secret commitments of President Roosevelt that have brought ruin and disaster to France and from which we have escaped only by a miracle, and the will of the American people expressed through Congress to keep America out of war." This was the America First movement back then. "President Roosevelt alarmed the nation by his inflammatory Italian dagger thrust in the heart speech." And on August 5th, Republican Representative Hamilton Fish said, "Whom do we fear? Do we fear Hitler, who seems afraid to attack England over 20 miles of sea when he would have 3,000 miles to cross here? This is preposterous. Let us stop this fear hysteria." And then on September 3rd, he said on the floor of the House, Republican Representative Fish of New York, peacetime conscription in America is the direct road to Hitlerism, dictatorship, and National Socialism. So he didn't want Roosevelt to start the draft. If we adopt peacetime conscription, we are merely copying Nazi methods and ideology. Mr. Speaker, this Roosevelt Far Eastern policy of bluff and bluster has driven Japan into the hands of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. No one in Japan really wants war with the United States, but it's quite evident that this highly proud and militaristic nation has got tired of being threatened and slapped in the face by us. We must not let our sympathies run away with our judgment and involve us in any Asiatic war 10,000 miles away that has no connection to the defense of the American continent. We have more to fear from the war makers within our country than from our enemies without. Yeah, got more to fear from Franklin Roosevelt than from Adolf Hitler. This is from Claire Hoffman, Republican representative of Michigan. And this is from a speech that Mr. Hoffman gave September 7, 1940. Mr. Speaker, down into the hell of a war, in no sense our war, this president would plunge us to satisfy his ambition to break the American tradition that no man should be elected a third time to the presidency, and in order that he may go down in history as America's first dictator. Yes, this is Republicans speaking on the floor of the House of Representatives, calling FDR a dictator in 1940. This is 1 year after Hitler had invaded Poland. Back to the quote. He told us, in effect, that we had no national defense, that we were open to successful invasion by a foreign foe. Thus, he created fear and hysteria. As on other occasions, when he had satisfied his penchant for theatrics by shouting "fire, fire" and calling Congress in special session at a cost of $500,000, he, figuratively speaking, now tucks his tongue in his cheek and goes off on a vacation. It is to be hoped on this one he will not, as he did on a prior occasion, see a mythical submarine. Roosevelt's threat to use the sovereignty of government is but the threat of a Hitler, of a Mussolini, a Stalin, to silence all opposition and all criticism. He has consistently arrayed class against class, preached envy and jealousy, the doctrine of hatred and fear, and his egotism is only equaled by his ignorance when we assume that patriotic Americans will tamely submit. The illustrious Dunderheads.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and Tessie Borden is on the line with us. Tessie is a communications specialist with Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice, CLUE. ClueJustice.org is the website. You can tweet Tessie at ClueJustice. Tessie, welcome to the program.
Hi, how are you?
I am well. Thank you for joining us. So the article that I have relative to your being on the program and everything is a headline, "Together We Fight Back, May Day March." Today is May Day in Los Angeles for workers' rights. Speak to us about A, May Day and its association with workers, and B, what's going on in Los Angeles.
Well, May Day is traditionally the day of the worker around the world. Here in Los Angeles, it also takes on, starting in about 2006, it takes on meaning for immigrants, because immigrants are also workers, and because on that day, we've traditionally had gatherings of immigrants to advocate for their rights as well. So this year, I think it's become really important for us to gather because of what we have been seeing in terms of attacks on workers and attacks on immigrants by the Trump administration. So we have three messages that we're aiming to send to the Trump administration, that we will defend, protect, and respect workers' rights, that we will fight the anti-immigrant agenda and stop ICE efforts to rip apart families, and that we will remain civically engaged in the run-up to this year's crucial midterm election.
Wow. Now, you're on your website over at ClueJustice.org. It says all religions believe in economic justice. And at Clue, we educate, organize, and mobilize the faith community to accompany workers and their families in their struggle for good jobs, dignity, and justice. I remember in the 60s and the early 70s, there was a substantial progressive religious movement from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King talking about social justice issues and war and peace issues and obviously civil rights issues, to the Berrigan brothers and large chunks of the Catholic Church who were engaged in I'm forgetting the phrase that they used back then, but social justice work, and to the Quakers were quite well organized. The Church of Christ was growing. Numbers of progressive denominations. And then, Reagan came along, and we saw this shift in the church groups. George W. Bush was responsible for the outreach to the right-wing religious community during the Reagan presidency and during his father's presidency and candidacy in '92. And basically the whole religious, or at least the Christian shtick in America, well, and to some extent the Jewish one too, became, we are now all conservatives and we're all right-wingers, and all this, right-wing religious infrastructure grew up on radio and in television. Pat Robertson became a billionaire. Jerry Falwell and others, numerous ones, died, and their sons took over their empires and flipped them into right-wing, hardcore right-wing, anti-worker, anti-rights organizations. Are you seeing a remobilization of the progressive religious community, or is this, the bare remnant hanging on by their fingernails?
Oh, not at all, not at all. I think that we've been working on that rebirth for quite a long time. CLU got started around 1997. And I think it was responding to sort of that perception, because it wasn't what was the truth on the ground, but it was a perception, that if you were a person of faith, you were likely to be conservative in terms of your politics. Okay. And the Catholic Church has for a very long time had social services that were reaching out to the poor and to the disenfranchised. And as you mentioned the Quakers, and there were several other denominations that were working in that area. It's just that I think what happened was that when the moral majority came up during those years, there was such an engagement on their side in terms of with the Republican Party and with trying to move the Republican Party to the right, that was sort of where a lot of the visibility was. But we have, been very allied with organized labor and with unions for as long as we have existed, and we are seeing now, because we're seeing the urgency, right, of changing the narrative around immigrants, around workers, that we're also seeing a lot of people who are coming to the fight that maybe were absent in the past. We're then trying to unite and coalesce, and May Day is a really great opportunity to do that. I've been participating in May Day for several years, and I have to tell you, this year I'm seeing a lot of people who in the past had maybe stayed away or were not super visible or were not super engaged. They are coming back, and they are really engaging around May Day to restart or reignite this fight on the fight of workers and on the fight of immigrants. Part of what we're seeing this year is this possible Janus decision that might be coming down from the Supreme Court. And given the makeup of the Supreme Court, we're sort of preparing for something that might not be favorable.
Right. This decision will decide whether a national right to work for less.
Correct.
Basically, it's a decision that will or will not put the final nail in the coffin of unions.
Well, you also see, though, across the country, the teachers are striking for more education, bigger education budgets, and better salaries, because their salaries have been so poor for such a long time.
Right, and they're striking on behalf of their kids.
Exactly, and so what you're seeing is I don't know that it would be the final nail in the coffin. It would be a serious challenge, but I think that what we're seeing is we're trying to figure out, okay, well then if this happens, what will be our paths? What will be our organizing alternatives? And there's been a lot of discussion within labor about that already, and I think that we are as allies of labor and as allies of immigrants, we're certainly part of that conversation.
We're talking with Tessie Borden, the communication specialist with Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice, CLUE. ClueJustice.org is the website. And Tessie, I went to elementary school in the 1950s in Lansing, Michigan, a union town. And what I learned as a little kid was that May Day had basically two things going. Number one, that workers all around the world celebrated May Day, and we had workers' celebrations of May Day in the 1950s in Michigan. And number two, that we'd all go out on the playground and build a maypole, which we later learned had to do with pagan holidays, spring celebrations in anticipation of a good crop yield. And now it seems like both of those foundations of May Day have been just stripped from our cultural knowledge base. How many people know the origins of May Day?
Yeah, I think that's on purpose because, Labor Day in the United States is September 1st or first Monday in September. And I think that was a very, conscious sort of anti-left kind of move in this country where we did not want to be associated with anything that had any kind of shading of being friendly to workers. And in 2006, we see that the immigrant rights movement in Los Angeles, in response again to attacks, to attacks in Congress on their rights, that it sprang forward and gave new life to this idea that workers celebrate who they are and their activism on May 1st. And I think this is something that, at least, like I said, in the time that I've been involved with it, I'm seeing it flower again. I'm seeing it, growing, not diminishing.
Yeah, and I think that's a good thing, broadly speaking. Tessie, thanks so much for dropping by. It's great.
Thank you very much.
Great talking with you, and I really appreciate your being part of our program. Tessie Borden,
Happy
Communications.
May Day.
Thank you. Happy May Day to you. Communications Specialist with Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice. ClueJustice.org is the website, and we'll be right back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Our phone number 202-808-9925. We'll be picking up your phone calls when we come back. And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. That was fascinating. But I think that there's some larger issues, or not necessarily. Okay, I'm quitting out of mine, Louise. You need to restart the whole. So on Tuesday morning, President Trump responded to the New York Times. Aaron Rupar is writing over at thinkprogress.org. On Tuesday morning, President Trump responded to the New York Times, publishing a list of questions that Special Counsel Robert Mueller reportedly wants to ask him. On Tuesday morning, Trump responded to the New York Times, publishing a list of questions that Special Counsel Robert Mueller reportedly wants to ask by touting that there are no questions on collusion. This was Trump's tweet. So disgraceful that the questions concerning the Russia witch hunt were leaked to the media Apparently they were leaked by the Trump administration. No questions on collusion. Well, the word collusion was not in any of the questions. Yeah, you don't say, hey, did you collude with the Russians? No, instead you say, when you met with the Russians, what did you ask them? And out of that, you find out if, there's an effort at collusion. So anyhow, he says, no questions on collusion. Oh, I see. You have a made-up phony crime, collusion, that never existed, and an investigation made with illegally leaked classified information. Nice. Actually, there are 13 questions that specifically speak to collusion. Those 13 questions are of Donald Trump. When did you become aware of the Trump Tower meeting? What involvement did you have in the communication strategy, including the release of Trump Jr.'s emails? During the 2013 trip to Russia, what communication and relationships did you have with the Agalarovs and the Russian government officials? What communication did you have with Michael Cohen, Felix Sater, and others, including foreign nationals, about Russian real estate developments during the campaign? What discussions did you have during the campaign regarding any meetings with Mr. Putin? Did you discuss it with others? And what discussions did you have during the campaign regarding Russian sanctions? Actually, they continue from there. What involvement did you have concerning platform changes regarding arming Ukraine? During the campaign, what did you know about Russian hacking, use of social media, or other acts aimed at the campaign? These are all collusion questions. These are all questions, basically, did you conspire with a foreign power to mess with our government? So can I open NeoScreener? What did you know about communications between Roger Stone and his associates and Julian Assange, WikiLeaks? What did you know about the transition about an attempt to establish back-channel communications with Russia and Jared Kushner's efforts? I mean, these are some serious questions. What did you know about the 2017 meeting in the Seychelles with Eric Prince and Russians? What did you know about a Ukrainian peace proposal provided to Mr. Cohen in 2017? I mean, this is, yeah, they note over Think Progress, Trump's comment about how disgraceful it is that Mueller's questions were leaked is ironic, given it appears the leak came from someone in his inner circle. The Times noted that the questions were read by Mueller's team to Trump's lawyers, who compiled them into a list. The document put together by Trump's lawyers was then provided to the Times by a person outside Mr. Trump's legal team. In other words, this was probably Trump or John Kelly or Sarah Sanders, somebody inside the White House. Somebody on, quote, Trump's side leaked this stuff. Pretty amazing, huh? We'll be back. It's 21 minutes past the hour. Thom Hartmann here with you. Donald Trump saying, oh, there's no questions about collusion. Over at Think Progress, Aaron Rupar puts together 13 questions specifically about collusion. Apparently, in fact, these questions were leaked by somebody on the Trump team. It's getting pretty bizarre. But speaking of truth and untruth and infiltration and all this other stuff, Sheldon Whitehouse, these are all Democratic senators, Sheldon Whitehouse, Edward Markey, Catherine Cortez Masto, Tom Udall, Ron Wyden, and Elizabeth Warren sent letters to 8 government agencies and to the White House requesting, quote, information related to efforts by Charles and David Koch, Koch Industries, and the numerous groups they fund to influence decisions, to influence government. You know, these guys are buying our government. They're buying our well, that's the concern, that they're buying our political system. Resumes obtained through public record requests by The Guardian and documented federal government watchdog group show the close links between high-ranking federal staffers and the Koch network. Sheldon Whitehouse, Rhode Island Democrat, said, I think right now it's the most powerful political force in the United States. If you don't believe that deregulation is good and that pollution ought not to be checked and that billionaires ought to be able to pull strings secretly in government, this ought to be a pretty high priority. They've identified 9 Koch-affiliated staff just at the Department of Interior, which oversees 400 million acres of public lands. And the Kochs also have a cattle operation that uses public lands. Gee, what a surprise. They include the principal deputy solicitor, Daniel Giorgiani, whose resume gives a sense of how he may respond to matters before the Interior Department. He was previously the director of the Charles Koch Foundation and the Charles Koch Institute and worked at the Koch-supported Freedom Partners. He worked in the Interior Department of George W. Bush, and his job was the project manager of a 105-person climate change task force. Now, was it its job to help solve the problem of climate change? No, its job was to, quote, limit damage from climate change alarmists. Seriously. In the current administration, Giorgiani has been linked to efforts to permit mining near the Boundary Water Canoe Area Wilderness in Minnesota and also to rescinding protection for migrating birds. A Koch document published by The Intercept celebrates its victories under Trump. Quote, in the first 11 months of President Trump's administration, the White House and Congress have followed closely the network's roadmap to repeal. This is the Koch brothers' three-step, or their group, three-step strategy to undo the legacy of Barack Obama. Repeal the Clean Power Plant, approve the Keystone XL pipeline, withdraw the U.S. from the Paris Climate Agreement. A late 2017 report, this again from Alistair Geese reporting over at thinkprogress.org. A late 2017 report by the nonprofit group Public Citizen suggests that 44 Trump administration officials had close ties to the Kochs, including Scott Pruitt, who runs the EPA now. Another is Vice President Mike Pence, about whom Steve Bannon has said, I'm concerned he'd be a president that the Kochs would own. This is pretty breathtaking. Excuse me. And meanwhile, in this same vein, we find that the Koch brothers now own university teachers. This from the Associated Press yesterday. Virginia's largest public university granted the conservative Charles Koch Foundation a say in the hiring and firing of professors in exchange for millions of dollars in donations, according to newly released documents. This follows years of denial by the university. They finally got hit with a FOIA request. This group is called Unkoch My Campus. And they say that this is the same thing that happened at Florida State.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
So the Koch brothers own the Republican Party, they own our politicians, they own this administration, and they own our college campuses. Is it time to declare the United States an oligarchy? It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study by Stefano Harney and Fred Moten. This is from the introduction. It starts with love, exchange, fellowship. It ends as it begins, in motion, in between various modes of being and belonging, and on the way to new economies of giving, taking, being with and for. And it ends with a ride in a Buick Skylark on a way to another place altogether. Surprising, perhaps, after we have engaged dispossession, debt, dislocation, and violence, but not surprising when you have understood that the projects of fugitive planning and black study are mostly about reaching out to find connection. They are about making common cause with the brokenness of being. A brokenness, I would venture to say, that is also blackness, that remains blackness, and will, despite all, remain broken because this book is not a prescription for repair. If we do not seek to fix what has been broken, then what? How do we resolve to live with brokenness, with being broke, which is also what Moten and Harney called debt? Well, given that debt is sometimes a history of giving, at other times a history of taking, at all times a history of capitalism, and given that debt also signifies a promise of ownership but never delivers on that promise, we have to understand that debt is something that cannot be paid off. Debt, as Harney puts it, presumes a kind of individualized realization to a naturalized economy that is predicated upon exploitation. Can we have, he asks, another sense of what is owed that does not presume a nexus of activities like recognition and acknowledgement, payment and gratitude? Can debt become a principle of elaboration? Moten thinks Moten links economic debt to the brokenness of being in the interview with Stefan Shukatis, who he acknowledges that some debts should be paid and that much is owed, especially to black people, by white people. And yet he says, I also know that it is, that what it is that is supposed to be repaired is irreparable. It can't be repaired. The only thing we can do is tear this stuff down completely and build something new, end of quote. The undercommons do not come to pay their debts, to repair what has been broken, to fix what has been undone. If you want to know what the undercommons wants, what Moten and Harney want, what black people, indigenous people, queers, and poor people want, what we who cohabit in the space of the undercommons want, it is this. We cannot be satisfied with the recognition and acknowledgement generated by the very system that denies A, that anything was ever broken, and B, that we deserve to be the broken part. So we refuse to ask for recognition, and instead we want to take apart, dismantle, tear down that structure right now. That right now limits our ability to find each other, to see beyond it, and to access the places that we know live outside its walls. We cannot say what new structures will replace the ones we live with yet, because once we have torn stuff down, we will inevitably see more and see differently and feel a new sense of wanting and being and becoming. What we want after the break will be different from what we think we want before the break, and both are necessarily different from the desires that issue from being in the dark. Let's come at this by another path. In the melancholic and visionary 2009 film version of Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are, 1963, Max, the small seeker who leaves his room, his home, his family to find the world beyond, finds a world of lost and lonely beasts, and they promptly make him their king. Max is the first king the wild things have had, whom they did not eat, and who did not, in turn, try to eat them. And the beasts are the first grown things that Max has met, who want his opinion, his judgment, and his rule. Max's power is that he is small while they are big. He promises the beasts that he has no plans to eat them, and that this is more than anyone has ever promised them. He promises them that he will find ways through and around and will slip through the cracks and re-crack the cracks if they fill up. He promises to keep sadness at bay and to make the world with the wild creatures that roared their terrible roars and gnashed their terrible teeth and rolled their terrible eyes and showed their terrible claws. That Max fails to make the wild things happy or to save them or to make the world with them is less important than the fact that he found them and he recognized in them the end of something and potentially the path to an alternative in his world, or an alternative to his world, excuse me. The wild things were not the utopian creatures of fairy tales. They were the rejected and lost subjects of the world Max had left behind. And because he shuttles between the Oedipal land where his mother rules and the ruined world of the wild, he knows the parameters of the real. He sees what is included and what is left out. And he is now able to set sail for another place, a place that is neither the home he left nor the home to which he wants to return. Moten and Harney want to gesture to another place, a wild place that is not simply the leftover space that limbs real and regulated zones of polite society. Rather, it is a wild place that continuously produces its own unregulated wilderness. The zone we enter through Moten and Harney is ongoing and exists in the present, and as Harney puts it, some kind of demand is already being enacted, fulfilled in the call itself. While describing the riots of London in 2011, Harney suggests that the riots and insurrections do not separate out the request, the demand, and the call. Rather, they enact the one in the other. The book is The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Welcome back. 34 minutes past the hour. Thom Hartmann here with you. Fair and only, slightly unbalanced. Ray in McHenry, Illinois. Hey, Ray, what's on your mind today? Thanks for listening to WCPT.
Hi, Tom. Every time I listen to all the news events, always two sayings I learned from my childhood always come to mind. One is, I was about to get in a fight once when I was 14 years old, and my wrestling coach grabbed me, and I thought, God, I'm in a lot of trouble. And all he said to me was, don't ever get into a fight unless you expect to get hurt.
Yeah.
And I just see so many times, Trump and these people talk like we're going to go kick some country's butt and they're just going to sit there and take it. People are going to die.
Yeah.
And everybody acts like we're some invincible, force. We're not.
Yeah.
And the other one my mom used to always tell me, she always said, your lies will find you out. How many times have we seen that happen in American politics? So, And the last thing I was going to say in answer to your question, I always think of it's like Star Wars, and Trump represents the dark side of being human. And it's always easier to be like him than it is to defend against him. He has, I always like to say he has a PhD in what he does. And I don't see any prominent Democrats right now who have the equivalent in what it will take to combat what he does. And we need an FDR-type personality, someone who's soft-spoken but whose words are really powerful and can reach people, someone who can talk to everyday people who are struggling, feeling lost, hopeless, and help them see how they're being encouraged to be irrational, and then that's being used against them.
Yeah.
I don't see any problem. Even Bernie, I love Bernie, but there's just too many ways he does things I think can be used against him. Somebody like Trump will just turn it on him. We need some. I don't see anybody yet. I haven't heard anybody talk that I think can do what needs to be done. So.
Yeah, well, I'm hoping it'll come. Ray, thanks for the call, and good points all. Very, very good points. Clyde in Las Cruces, New Mexico. It says that you're 90 years old and you want to weigh in?
Yes, I'm 90 years old. I'm a veteran of World War II. And you were talking about labor unions. And labor unions made this country what it is today. I'm retired now and have a comfortable living because of the I worked 30 years in the coal mines, and I have a comfortable living. And I'm sick to the stomach when I see what Trump is doing to this nation, and I'm in hopes that during the next election that Trump will be a forgotten thing. I remember all of the presidents from Roosevelt to Trump, and this is the worst period of time for the United States that I've ever seen.
Yeah. Are you? Do you have any sense of history repeating itself, Clyde? You lived through the Great Depression and World War II.
Oh yes. I have a very men were out of work. I never did go hungry because we had a little farm and I had a cow, but men were working for $2 a day, and actually when I got out of the Navy in 1946, I went to work in the coal mines. I was working 9 hours for under $9 a day. And when I retired because of the union, I was working for $123 for an 8-hour shift. And I have a pension from that. I also was working for the post office, and I was in the group that formed the post office from the U.S. Postal Service to what the post office is today. And I'm so pleased at the way this country has been run. And I voted Democrat all my life, and the reason I did is I raised a family, and it was always easier for me to raise a family when there was a Democrat in the White House. And I just wanted to let everybody know that this part of the country, or our country today, is in the 90-plus years that I've been on this earth. This is the most terrible thing that our country has ever gone through. I've never seen the president being such a liar. And I really, Tom, I really appreciate you letting me vent my anger on President Trump.
Yeah.
And,
well, Clyde,
thank you very much.
You're welcome, and I very much appreciate your calling and sharing your insight and experience with us, Clyde. I hope to hear from you again. Thank you for the call, and I hope when I'm 90, I'm as sharp as you are. Speaking of people who are 90 years old, let's hear Ronald Reagan tell a story about a 90-year-old. This 90-year-old's name was, as I recall, Smith L. Carpenter. Maybe it was Carpenter L. Smith. And Reagan, in 1948, was on the radio. In fact, here he is. Hang on just a second. Here he is.
This is Ronald Reagan speaking to you from Hollywood. You know me as a motion picture actor. But tonight I'm just a citizen, pretty concerned about the national election next month, and more than a little impatient with those promises the Republicans made before they got control of Congress a couple of years ago. I remember listening to the radio on election night in 1946. Joseph Martin, the Republican Speaker of the House, said very solemnly, and I quote, "We Republicans intend to work for a real increase in income for everybody by encouraging more production and lower prices without impairing wages or working conditions."
1946, by the way, was the year that, for the first time since the Great Depression, since 1932, that the Republicans recaptured the House of Representatives. They held it for one session for 2 years, 47, 48, and then they lost it in 48 and didn't get it back again until Bill Clinton was president. But the Republicans took power, and Reagan is going to call them out for it.
Unquote. Remember that promise, a real increase in income for everybody. But what actually happened? The profits of corporations have doubled, while workers' wages have increased by only 1/4. In other words, profits have gone up 4 times as much as wages. And the small increase workers did receive was more than eaten up by rising prices, which have also bored into their savings. For example, here's an Associated Press dispatch I read the other day about Smith L. Carpenter.
Smith L. Carpenter. You're going to love the punchline. Listen to this story.
A craftsman in Union Springs, New York. Seems that Mr. Carpenter retired some years ago thinking he had enough money saved up so that he could live out his last years without having to worry. But he didn't figure on this Republican inflation, which ate up all his savings.
Oh, the Republican inflation. Tell us all about it, Ronnie.
And so he's gone back to work. The reason this is news is Mr. Carpenter is 91 years old.
There you go.
Now, take as a contrast the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, which reported a net profit of $210 million after taxes for the first half of 1948, an increase of 70% in 1 year. In other words, high prices have not been caused by higher wages, but by bigger and bigger profits.
Oh, it's the
Republican
corporations.
promises sounded pretty good in 1946. But what has happened since then, since the 80th Congress took over? Prices have climbed to the highest level in history, although the death of the OPA was supposed to bring prices down through, quote, the natural process of free competition, unquote. Labor has been handcuffed by the vicious Taft-Hartley law.
The vicious Taft-Hartley law. This is the law that allowed for so-called right-to-work states. Ronald Reagan. Labor has been handcuffed by the vicious Taft-Hartley Act.
Social Security benefits have been snatched away from almost 1 million workers by the Gearhart bill.
Yeah, see, that's what Republicans do.
Fair employment practices, which had worked so well during wartime, have been abandoned. Veterans' pleas for low-cost homes have been ignored, and many people are still living in made-over chicken coops and garages. Tax reduction bills have been passed to benefit the higher income brackets alone.
Whoa! Ronnie Reagan is opposed to tax cuts for the rich in 1948.
The average worker saved only $1.73 a week. In the false name of economy, millions of children have been deprived of milk once provided through the federal school lunch program.
Ronald Reagan was once in favor of school lunches. It was Reagan, by the way, you'll recall, who declared that ketchup was a vegetable so that school lunches didn't have to actually, spend the money for vegetables, because, gee, that would have increased the cost of school lunches.
This was the payoff of the Republicans' promises. And this is why we must have new faces in the Congress of the United States, Democratic faces. This is why we must elect not only President Truman, but also men like Mayor Hubert Humphrey of Minneapolis, the Democratic candidate for senator from Minnesota.
Hubert Humphrey ran for president in 1968 against Richard Nixon.
Mayor Humphrey of 37 is one of the ablest men in public life. He's running against Joe Ball, who was a member of the Senate Labor Committee, helped write the Taft-Hartley law. The Republicans don't want to lose Ball, and they're spending a small fortune on his campaign. They've even sent Dewey and Warren out to Minneapolis to speak for him. President Truman knows the value of a man like Hubert Humphrey in the Senate, and he has been in Minneapolis, too, campaigning against Joe Ball.
This is Ronald Reagan in 1948, broadcasting nationwide on the radio. It's a 4-minute ad for Democrats by Ronald Reagan on I don't know if it was the Blue Network or the Red Network or what it was called at the time, but there you go. How quickly they change.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
All Reagan had to do was marry Nancy Davis and have a nice talk with her very wealthy and powerful businessman dad who said, Ronnie, I can make you rich. Become a Republican. And welcome back. Steve, I don't have a city or state for you. It just says you're on the internet. Where are you calling from? Steve? I'm not hearing Steve. He must be listening to his TV. Okay. Well, I'm going to set you aside here. There's a new PAC. This is an amazing story. It's a new PAC. Josh Israel is writing about this over at thinkprogress.org. A guy by the name of Joe Bowen, who, had worked for Democrats for years. He'd been running Democratic campaigns and whatnot. And he said when he was diagnosed with a rare form of blood cancer some months ago, he decided that he wanted to use his skills to take the fight to the NRA. And so this guy has launched a website. It's called endthenra.org. And his goal is, and I quote, to make the lives of the NRA's leadership, board members, and high-profile supporters a living hell. Whoa. He says too many politicians are beholden to the people who are willing to spend more than $50 million on elections in 2016. That would be the NRA. And in fact, there's a big question of, did that $50 million the NRA spend on Republicans in the last election, did 40 million of it come from Russia? Anyhow, the NRA, he points out, the NRA will not strive for reasonable compromises. They've never made an effort to be reasonable, he says, and neither should we. So what are they doing? Well, he's starting out, he's going to put billboards in Virginia near the home of the wealthy, kind of the number one guy, Wayne LaPierre. His title is Executive Vice President, but he is the face of the National Rifle Association. They're going to put a billboard near his home listing the names of every mass shooting victim in the past year. And they say future actions will focus on naming and shaming the NRA's leadership and the politicians who toe the line for the NRA. He says, we're just done with politics as usual. This is great. endthenra.org. Sean, we should get this guy on. This is spectacular. I'll stick the story right over there. And then that, and the other piece that I wanted to draw your attention to is in today's Washington Post. And it's titled, Rare Trifecta of Soaring Stocks, Cheap Loans, and Low Inflation Coming to an End. And basically what they're pointing out, David Lynch is pointing out in this op-ed piece, is that the last decade or so, we have had a very abnormal economy. before the crash, before the George Bush crash in 2008, and since the George Bush crash. The economy has been weird, and it's been weird because the stock market has been going up faster than it's gone up since 1929. Loans are super cheap, and they have been for a decade now. In fact, a little longer than a decade. And inflation has been really low. And it looks like all of those dynamics are about to change. And when they change, we're going to slide into an economic era that is more normal. In other words, the normal cycles of the economy. We're now in the second longest expansion in the history of the United States. And these things do not last long. And as we leave this expansion, because the foundation of it was not manufacturing, the foundation of it was loans, I think that we're going to see another major crisis. And this is what he's pointing out, David Lynch is pointing out in this piece for the Washington Post. I encourage you to check it out. It's really worth reading. We'll be back. I'm going to pick up your phone calls right after this. It's coming up on 10 minutes before the hour. Defending America from the weapons of mass deception, it's Thom Hartmann. Lenny in Hollywood, Florida, listening on Sirius XM. Hey, Lenny, what's on your mind?
Tom, I had a question for you. Do you think that out of the Mueller investigation, with all this dark money running around, like you earlier pointed out, if the NRA got all that, do you think there'll be some new legislation that'll come out that might be able to get rid of Citizens United out of all that?
Citizens United, I'm skeptical about, but I'm hopeful. You know, it's a possibility. If you look at the last time we had a major political scandal, which was the Nixon administration in 72, 73, 74, the last time that happened, well, actually, yeah, it was 72 that the Watergate break-in happened and got busted. Then you had the election of 72, and then it started unraveling in 73, and in 74, Nixon left office. What came out of that in 74 and 75 was a series of really substantial legislative victories for clean politics. You know, we passed laws limiting how much money rich people could give to politicians, limiting how much they could give to their campaigns, limiting how much they could give to individual political parties, limiting corporate actors in these arenas. And of course, then the Supreme Court ran to the rescue of the oligarchs in 1976 with the Buckley decision, Buckley versus Vallejo, in which they ruled that by limiting the free speech of billionaires, or limiting the financial contributions of billionaires, we were in fact limiting their free speech, something that is protected by the First Amendment of the Constitution. And that Buckley decision set the stage for Citizens United in 2010, and the McCutcheon decision in 2013, and all of these decisions that basically have expanded the power of billionaires to corrupt and own our democracy and our politicians. So if history repeats itself, if the Mueller investigation leads to an impeachment or a stepping out of office by Donald Trump, or simply a large enough scandal that Americans are scandalized and horrified and want to do something about it, I think it's entirely possible, Larry, that we will see legislation that might even include court stripping provisions so that the Supreme Court can't strike it down, that actually, tries to clean up our money and politics problem. I certainly hope so. We'll see. Lenny, thanks for the call and thanks for the question. It was a good one. Lori in Bellevue, Florida. Hey, Lori, what's up?
Hey, Tom. How are you?
I'm fine. What's on your mind?
I've been thinking about Congress because they really seem to be doing so much of nothing compared to all the oversight they gave Benghazi. And I just see day after day all of the norms being violated and broken by the president and all of his cronies and the Koch brothers and everybody that's paying our executive branch. And I think that Congress has a specific duty called oversight. And they're kind of the parent to the executive overreach. And they're watching the kids destroy the house.
And cheering it on.
And the community, the environment. And they're letting in robbers and hackers and thugs and mob-like people.
Yeah.
we should really start to not just blame Trump, because he's a bad boy, and he's kind of being let to run amok.
And it's all because the same group of billionaires owns all of them. And, you know, the Mercers and the Kochs and the Adelsons and whatnot, they basically own the Republican Party. And so the Republican Party is all dancing to the same. And of course, Fox so-called News, owned by billionaire Rupert Murdoch, is, you know, the official news device of the billionaires. And here we are.
It's crazy, but we need to share this horrible upset that we have over the president. It's not just Donald Trump. It's everybody that's allowing him to do it.
Yeah, it's the entire GOP and the donor class that allows them to exist. Well said, Lori. Thank you for the call. Very well said. Buck in San Clemente. Hey, Nixon's old stomping grounds. Hey, Buck, what's on your mind?
Yeah, there were bumper stickers that used to say, you know, come and visit San Clemente. Nixon owns it, or Nixon paid for it. Anyway, I would just want to mention Trump's tirade on Fox and Friends last week. How he just went off, and I'm going to be at the VA tomorrow, so can't call in. I wanted you to pass on to Mark Pocan that I think he's the real deal Democrat, and his philosophies and he stands for the FDR stuff. But I wanted to call in last week and say that to him, but I didn't get a chance to, and I can't tomorrow. But anyway, on Trump's tirade last week, he went on and on about the people really in the investigation who are investigating him. And I went, if you give me 15 seconds here.
Sure.
The people that are doing the investigation, you have 13 people that are Democrats. You have Hillary Clinton people. You have people that worked on Hillary Clinton's foundation. They're all, I don't mean Democrats. I mean like the real deal.
That's right, baby. They're the real deal Democrats.
Well, unfortunately, I don't think that there are any Democrats, or very few, who are involved in this investigation. I mean, you know, Mueller's a Republican. Chris Wray is a Republican. The Rubenstein is a Republican. I don't know of any who are Democrats. I mean, you had Neil McCabe's wife ran as a Democrat, but Neil McCabe is a Republican. So
you're right, Tom. But I'm just saying.
Yeah, he just
the real deal Democrats, the real FDR Democrats. They're the ones who are the exact opposite of Trump.
Yeah, and
they're the ones he fears.
Yeah, and we need more of them. Buck, thanks for the call. Well said. Russell in Prudhoe Bay, Alaska. Russell, we only have 30 seconds. You have a real quick point you want to make?
Yeah, I was wondering if with runaway inflation, what would happen to Donald Trump's debt that he owes?
Oh, he'd be in big trouble, as will everybody else in the United States who owes money, and including the federal government now with $20 trillion in debt, and Trump just added another $5 trillion to it with the tax scam. Excellent question, excellent point. Russell, I hope we can have a longer conversation later in the week or next week. Thank you so much for watching us in Prudhoe Bay, though. We'll be back tomorrow. You know, Lord willing and the creek don't rise. Mark Pocan should be with us in the first hour. We have that, Sean? Yep. Okay, cool. And, you know, for middays for Mark, with Mark. And in the meantime, don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It's not enough to just sit on your couch and complain. You gotta do something. You can do it from your couch, but you gotta do something. Get out there, get active, tag. You're it. We'll see you tomorrow.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, ecowine.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally.
Call 800-568-9889 or go to tomsbeets.com. That's 800-568-9889, Tom's Beets, THOMSBEETS.com.